Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 61 to 87. Chapter 61 Papal Response. The Supreme Pontiff was an elderly man in his early 60s who was of Italian descent. Currently, the man sat upon the throne as he listened to grave news regarding the arrest and execution of a duo of the Church's inquisitors within the Barony of Kufstein. In his hand was a letter written by Berengar. During the time it took for Father Antonio to return to the Vatican to make his report, Berengar had used his printing press to distribute flyers in the German language accusing the Church of attempting to usurp his family's lands. By now, these propaganda pamphlets had spread throughout all of Tyrol and parts of Bavaria and the other Austrian counties. Pope Simeon II rubbed his temples intensely, trying desperately to decrease his growing headache. He had no idea how the young regent had managed to write so many of these pesky things and distributed them so quickly. The Pope exhaled heavily before voicing his thoughts aloud. "This boy is certainly bold. I will give him that. You said he had a message for me?" Father Antonio was kneeling before the Pope. Beside him were several cardinals who acted as the Holy Father's advisors. Father Antonio quickly responded to the Pope and began to inform him of Berengar's message word for word. After the frightening display of authority Berengar had used to intimidate the priest, Father Antonio had ingrained the young regent's words into the very depths of his mind. "Lord Berengar told me that when you return to the Vatican inform the Holy Father, that he may have the power to excommunicate me and to brand me a heretic, but ultimately when I finally perish from this world it is under the judgment of God, not the Pope, that will determine whether or not I enter the kingdom of heaven." The Pope's expression stiffened as he heard these words. Berengar was clearly challenging his authority as the personal representative of God on earth. The young lord's words were essentially daring the Holy Father to act in such a manner and prove how worthless such a punishment was. A nearby cardinal had a furious expression on his face as he could no longer hold back the anger burning in his heart. "Blasphemy! You all heard what Father Antonio said. The boy does not recognize the authority of the Church. He must be brought to heel, and quickly, before such blasphemous ideas spread to the rest of the German nobility." "God wills it." Half of the cardinals in the room immediately responded in the same manner. "God wills it, yes." However, another cardinal quickly countered the impassioned outcry of the man who called for Berengar's demise. "How do you suppose we do that? He has already stated he does not care if he is excommunicated and branded a heretic. All of the holy orders are currently fighting wars at the moment. The Teutonic Order is fighting in the east against the Rus. The Hospitallers are in North Africa waging holy war against the Saracens to reclaim Alexandria for Christendom. The Spanish orders are all waging reconquista. Even if we could spare the men, how would that look to the other German noblemen? Many of them would certainly rally behind Berengar. If we march into Kufstein now, we will only be justifying his behavior, which is exactly what the boy wants." Quickly the cardinals began to bicker among themselves like a bunch of children as every one of them spat out a different idea on how to handle the scenario. It had been a long time since any lord in Europe, especially one with a lowly position like Berengar, had slapped the Church in the face in such a manner. It was an outright rejection of their power and authority over Christendom and a total humiliation to the Inquisition. Under normal circumstances, the Church would call for a crusade to wipe out the heresy within Kufstein. However, since all of the surviving holy orders were currently expanding Christian influence elsewhere, they could not afford to send an army into the Alps at the moment. Eventually, the Holy Father had enough of the infighting among his cardinals and declared his solution to the issue. "Enough. We will excommunicate Berengar, brand him a heretic, and deny his accusations against us. Then we will paint the picture that he is a vile, wicked, and sinful man who engages in debauchery on a daily basis. As for invading Kufstein, we will leave that option on the table in case he misbehaves again in the future. Do you really believe the people will obey the rule of a man who the Church has labeled as a disciple of Satan?" The room fell quiet with this declaration. Those who were thirsty for the blood of Berengar, and the people of Kufstein quietly calmed themselves and accepted the Pope's words as law. If the boy wanted to be a tyrant, they would show him that he cannot rule so easily without the support of the common people. Unfortunately for them, they were making a huge mistake, as the local church in Kufstein was plagued with corruption, and like most churches, embezzled a large portion of the money they received from tithes. Under Berengar's reforms, he had brought a great degree of prosperity to the common people within his domain. Combine this with the fact that the people in his territory were becoming literate and reading the Bible independently. There was a growing sense of distrust with the Catholic Church within the Barony of Kufstein. It would not be long before these views spread across Tyrol and, by extension, Austria. After all, Berengar's spy networks were growing by the day. His views of the Church and its role in society were quite popular among many nobility who were dissatisfied with the Church's interference with their secular rule over their dynastic lands. As such, by excommunicating Berengar, declaring him a heretic, and attempting to sabotage his reputation, the Vatican had unwittingly taken the first step to the reformation of the Church within the German-speaking regions and the removal of papal authority. When Berengar heard the Church's response to his actions, he was reported to have a wicked grin on his face as if everything was going according to plan. Chapter 62: A not-so-civil discussion. Currently, Lind stood face to face with Adela. The day would soon come for Adela to return home, and she was currently in a heated debate with her rival. The little girl had for quite some time had suspicions about Lind and Berengar and their illicit relationship. However, she had been in denial up until this point. Currently, the two conflicted with the fact that Adela would be returning to her homeland, while Lind would remain in Kufstein, which acted as a thorn in Adela's side, constantly reminding her of the possibility that Berengar would sleep with the teenage temptress if she left the two of them alone. Lambert's accusations at the scene of his conviction also left a lasting impression on her. He seemed to be certain that Berengar was the father of Linda's child, and such Adela had grown quite vicious in the little scuffle between the two girls. Berengar, of course, was not present for the conflict. Otherwise, he would have acted as a mediator and gotten the two of them to calm down. However, since she could not do so, Adela began to raise her voice at Lind in her frustration. "What right do you have to stay in Kufstein now that your fiancé is gone?" Lind sneered devilishly at Adela. She knew the little girl was jealous of her, and she was not afraid to shove it in Adela's adorable little face as she deflected the question. "Oh, my Adela, are you perhaps jealous?" The very idea that Adela would be jealous, while accurate, infuriated her, and she quickly latched onto the bait. She was not an experienced debater, as could be seen by the ease of falling prey to Linda's trap. "Jealous? That's preposterous. Why would I be envious of you?" Lind leaned in close to Adela, showing off her mighty bosom in an act of superiority as she taunted the girl further. "Obviously, you are jealous of the fact that I get to stay here by Berengar's side while you have to go back to Graz. Don't worry, I will take good care of your fiancé while you are away." The strawberry blonde-haired vixen purposely emphasized the last part in great detail as she whispered in Adela's little ear in an attempt to infuriate her further. Though Lind had accepted her role as the lover and that she would never be Berengar's bride, she still found teasing her master's little fiancé to be delectable. Of course, if Berengar were here to witness such a scene, he would punish Lind for her actions. Adela's face grew red like a strawberry as she envisioned all kinds of naughty things between Lind and Berengar and immediately felt embarrassed. She began to stammer as she found it difficult to form a sentence in her disrupted state. "Why, you harlot, how dare you?" Linda's face was no longer grinning with satisfaction but had turned furious as she gazed at Adela with the intent to slap the little bitch. Being referred to as such a term greatly offended Lind in her pride as Berengar's lover. After all, she had only ever been with one man. Nevertheless, she refrained from backhanding Berengar's fiancé as she knew he would be genuinely displeased with her actions if she did so. Thus she forced herself to calm down and refute Adela's harsh words. "Oh little Adela, you are quite wrong about that. I have only ever shared my body with one man. I am quite the opposite of what you claim." Due to the cryptic nature of Linda's refutation, Adela could not help but blurt out the question, digging at the very essence of her soul. "Oh yeah, and who might that be?" Lind was waiting for this response and ended the argument with another vague answer that was sure to antagonize Adela further. This was her way of punishing the little girl for daring to call her such a wicked term. "I'll leave that up to your imagination." With that said, Lind walked away from Adela with a sinister smile on her face. She knew she had won this argument. Of course, Adela was fuming with fury as she watched Lind leave her behind. However, she quickly realized that she had never been able to get the answer from Lind about why she was allowed to stay in Kufstein. She could not help but curse herself after Lind had disappeared. That bitch. On the other hand, Lind had pressing matters to attend to and proceeded to her quarters, where she began to communicate with her subordinates in the spy network she had helped establish, informing them of boosting propaganda efforts across German-speaking regions. Sooner or later tales of Berengar's benevolence to his people and the crimes he suffered at the hands of his little brother with the backing of the church would spread by word of mouth through Tyrol and Trient. From their travelers and merchants would spread the stories across the entirety of Greater Germany. These stories of Berengar's treatment of the common people within his realm would make the Barony of Kufstein a common destination for refugees when the war finally broke out. Even Lind had no idea how effective these stories would be as they were passed around inns and taverns across the land. On the other hand, Adela was ruing the forthcoming day when she would have to return to Graz and was currently spending more time with Berengar. At the moment, she was complaining about Lind and wanted an official answer from Berengar on why she was allowed to stay. Berengar, why is Lind allowed to stay now that Lambert is gone and disowned? She's no longer engaged and has no further ties to this land. Berengar saw the pouting face of Adela and could not help but pinch her cheeks as he reprimanded her for approaching Lind about such a question. I know you're jealous, but don't worry, she has a valid reason to be here. Her father was a backer in my brother's plots and does not trust I will continue to conduct business in good faith now that his involvement has been revealed. Thus he has decided to leave her here in Kufstein to oversee our trade. Besides, it's not like she can get married anymore now that she's pregnant. The least I can do is take care of my brother's bastard considering that he is no longer around to raise it. Berengar almost had a Freudian slip at that moment, and it did not go unnoticed by Adela, who frowned deeply as she heard Berengar proclaim that he was going to be raising Linda's child. She cursed that she was still too young to get married, otherwise, it would be her who was pregnant with Berengar's child at the moment. Such thoughts immediately caused her face to flush red with embarrassment. She quickly stormed out of Berengar's room in an attempt to hide her shameful thoughts, leaving Berengar staring at the doorway, thinking to himself. What did I do to upset her now? The minds of the fairer sex were truly unfathomable to men. Chapter 63 Joining the Teutonic Order. Currently, Lambert was still within the confines of the prison carriage constructed for his transport to the Teutonic Order. They had traveled for several weeks with a caravan to Malbork Castle within the Pomerelia region to maintain the transported prisoners' safety and integrity. Lambert sat in his cage with a blanket over his shoulders. The only thing keeping him alive throughout his journey was the idea that he would return home one day and exact vengeance upon his family for what they had done to him. The state of the Teutonic Order, oftentimes referred to as the Teutonic State, was currently embroiled in a series of wars against the Eastern European populations. Whether they were pagans or Eastern Orthodox, the fanatical crusaders of the Teutonic Order did not care and used whatever excuses they could to justify their wars of conquest. Pomerelia, however, was far closer to the borders of Germany and was merely used as a training ground for recruits, to foster them into the order and their way of life over time. As a militant order of the Catholic Church, the Teutonic Knight required all full brothers to take monastic vows. They would become celibate and father no children, nor could they ever marry. If they were noblemen, they would give up all claims to their family's lands. This was a genius act by Gisela to spare Lambert's life while making him no longer a threat to Berengar's position. On the other hand, Lambert saw this as a chance to rise in the ranks of the Teutonic Order and gain enough power to enact vengeance upon the family that had abandoned him. Especially that whore Lind, he would never forgive her for her misdeeds. After all the time and energy he had spent courting her, she threw it all away for his despicable brother. He was utterly disgusted with himself for being such a fool as to think he could be with a girl like Lind and putting up with her degrading acts because of it. Not long after having these thoughts, Castle Malbork came into sight, and the sentries of the Teutonic Order rode out to meet with the approaching caravan. A knight in full plate armor, with a white tabard and black cross emblazoned on it, stopped before the carriage and gave his commands. By orders of the Grand Master, all outsiders are forbidden from traveling beyond this point. State your business or be on your way. The caravan guard was not the least bit threatened by the knight and calmly stated his reasons for being in the area. By decree of Siegfried von Kufstein, the Baron of Kufstein, this young man Lambert has been convicted of the crimes of assassination, treason, and attempted fratricide and hereby sentenced to join the Teutonic Order where he may redeem himself in the eyes of God in righteous crusade. Though the knight's face could not be seen beneath the visor of his great bassinet, his exasperated expression could be heard in his voice as he sighed deeply. Another one? All right, we will escort the prisoner from henceforth. SS. The truth was, crusading was not nearly as popular as it was in the previous centuries. After the French conspired against the Templars for their wealth and burned them all at the stake as heretics, many people had no desire to suffer a similar fate. Nowadays, the ranks of the Teutonic Order were filled with either convicted criminals, refugees, orphans, or disillusioned noble youth. Despite the success of the Crusades to the Holy Land within this timeline, the Northern Crusades were not exactly popular in the eyes of the people of Christendom. In many countries, one might even say they were unpopular, especially now that the heathens of the Baltic had mostly been conquered and were in the process of being Germanized, which was a polite way of saying that they were being wiped out entirely and replaced by ethnic Germans. Regarding the other so-called Holy Crusades, Reconquista was a matter of Iberian pride. As such, the militant orders of the region swelled with the ranks of zealous young men who wished to drive the Moors from their lands. However, unless one were particularly hateful of Muslims, they would not venture from another region to join the fight to reclaim Iberia. The ongoing crusades in North Africa, if you could even call them such a thing, were mostly handled by the might of the Byzantine Empire's vast army, who wished to reclaim lost territory in Egypt and Libya. Despite being Orthodox, the Byzantines and the Orthodox Church were far more cordial in this timeline with Europe and the Vatican. As such, they had gained the support of the Hospitaller Order in the efforts to reclaim North Africa for Christendom. This was far more popular than the Northern Crusades among Catholics and Orthodox alike, as they were reclaiming lost land instead of venturing into backwaters and forcefully converting the natives. Upon hearing the knight's orders, the caravan guards quickly got down from their carriages and released the lock on the gates which confined Lambert, where he was swiftly dragged out of his cell and handed over to the Knights of the Teutonic Order, who carried him off to the castle of Malbork. This would be the last time the boy saw the banners of House von Kufstein for some time. He would forever engrave them in his memory as he desired to see them burning along with his homeland. After arriving in the castle, Lambert was led to the recruits' quarters, where he acquired the attire of an initiate and had his head shaved. For the next few months, his life would be a grueling hell as he toiled and slaved away to prove himself worthy of the title of brother. Luckily for him, he was already a competent swordsman and would quickly make a name for himself among the initiates and the order members alike. After having a simple meal for the evening, he returned to his quarters, where he began to drift into a deep slumber. The thoughts of vengeance were the only thing that would allow him to survive this ordeal. Chapter 64, Supplying the Militia. Berengar was currently standing in one of his many nitraries, formed to produce saltpeter from common manure. It was the primary ingredient in the creation of gunpowder and was very rare in Europe as a naturally occurring substance. However, with the knowledge he gained from his previous life, which was far more advanced than this world, he knew of a way to create it from manure, ash, plant greens, and of course, cow urine. Though this was an extensive process, and as such, he had been relying on the trade networks throughout to import the material for the use in his militia's weapons. However, after nearly 4 months of producing the material, his first batch of homegrown saltpeter was about to come to fruition. Since he initially constructed his industrial district, he had set aside an area to produce potassium nitrate, also known as saltpeter. These facilities were called nitraries. With an ever-increasing demand for gunpowder, he had expanded his nitraries throughout the industrial sector and even into dedicated plots of land outside the burgeoning town. Though the process was simple, it took a lot of time to complete. Essentially, one would create a waterproof mixture of manure, green plant matter, and ash. From there, they would make sure it was covered in a stable environment with limited sunlight and pour the cow urine on the mixture once a week for 3 to 4 months. Eventually, yellow crystals would form, be skimmed out of the mixture, and then placed into a bucket with holes in the bottom with a paper filter. The remainder of the bucket would be filled 3/4 of the way with the leftover pile and have boiling water poured into it until the pile was gone. This process would be repeated until all of the saltpeter could be harvested, where it would then be mixed with charcoal and sulfur to make black powder. Now was finally the day when his armies no longer had to rely on expensive imports of the rare material and could produce it themselves in a constantly growing capacity. Truthfully, Berengar pitied the men who had to work in the nitraries, as it seemed like a filthy job to him, but it was entirely necessary, and thus they were paid very well for their labor. There was a gaze of pride on Berengar's face as he saw the results of his efforts and was greatly pleased by them. He congratulated the men on their first successful batch of the substance. "Men, You have done an amazing job these last few months, and I hereby award you all with a 10% raise to your salaries. Keep up the excellent work, and more rewards are sure to come." The men who engaged in such dirty work were truly ecstatic when they heard they were given a raise for their performances. All of their hard work had paid off. However, they could not become complacent and needed to begin preparing the next batch. A continuous supply of the substance was necessary for Berengar to wage war in the most efficient manner possible. Thus Berengar left the men to their work as he returned to his other enterprises. Berengar noticed that the men beneath his command were currently running drills as per usual. There was a constant influx of recruits within the militia, which acted more as a national guard than an army at the moment. Despite some of the men in his militia being inducted into the town guard full-time, the majority of them only trained on weekends after completing basic and specialized training. Currently, his militia had reached his goal of roughly 1,000 foot soldiers in 6 companies, as well as 2 full artillery batteries filled with a total of 12 field guns and 300 men. He was 1 artillery battery away from fielding a full artillery battalion. A feat which he would desire to achieve shortly. However, it would be some time yet until he could achieve it. Berengar had gone through great expense to acquire a sufficient supply of warhorses, something his region was desperately lacking. As such, he currently only had a company of 80 cavalrymen, though he had initially decided to use demi-lancers. Ultimately he had changed his mind after he considered the fact that for now, he would be fighting medieval armies, without any significant access to gunpowder. As such he decided to go with the extremely effective cuirassiers which would be capable of breaking any spear formations with their pistols, before charging them down with their sabers. This elite unit of heavy cavalry was equipped in 3/4 plate armor, with an enclosed burgonet, and a pair of gauntlets. The weapons they wielded were a pair of pistols, as well as a Dussac sword. Recognizing his dire need for warhorses, Berengar had begun a breeding program for species such as coursers. Still, it would be years before he could see the results in any significant capacity. Thus, for now, all he could do was import the horses to his region at a high cost. Luckily for him, his family was now extraordinarily wealthy due to the steel and textile trades. Many noblemen were willing to pay a premium to get their hands on such a large quantity of steel for use in their armies. Completely unaware that against Berengar's forces, mass equipping your forces with steel brigandine and plate was useless, but then again, they never expected Berengar to have such lofty ambitions. After overseeing the militia exercises, Berengar returned to his home, where he sat in his father's study with a liter of beer in his hands, slowly going over the remaining paperwork for the day. Tomorrow Adela would depart from his land, and he would not be able to see his little fiancée's adorable face for some time. At least he would be able to visit her for her birthday in a few months, speaking of which he should probably have some exquisite jewelry made for her to show his affection. After thinking about such things, he spent the remainder of his nightly work drafting plans for a ludicrously expensive set of jewels for his beloved. Chapter 65 Monogamy is for Suckers. The day had arrived, and Berengar was up bright and early, properly dressed to see his little fiancée off from his territory so that she may return home to her homeland. Despite her suspicions about Berengar's potential affair with Lind, she had been quite happy during these past few months she spent getting to know her fiancé. After some serious soul-searching over the past few days, she had concluded that even if Berengar had secretly taken Lind as a lover, she would still marry him. She was confident in her ability to keep Berengar by her side, even if he did spend time with Lind. Who knows, maybe when her body finally matured, she would be even more beautiful than Lind. At that point, she could easily monopolize Berengar's love. Her only fear was that if Berengar was truly the father of Linda's child, that one day he might legitimize the bastard, and if it were to be born a boy, that bastard boy would become the heir to his titles. As such, she had decided she would do whatever it took to put her own future son on the throne in which Berengar was sure to carve out of this world. Truthfully, Berengar had been dreadfully busy these past few days and saw very little of either of his women and thus was unaware of the conflicts between them or the resolutions they had come to. However, to see her off, he was here now, and Lind was not present. Fearing it might sour the relationship between her lover and his fiancé, she felt it would be best to be absent. Though she liked teasing Adela, she had no plans to steal her position as the wife. Berengar had made it clear that he intended to marry Adela and that his mind would not be swayed, and Lind had come to accept that. Adela stood in front of her luxurious carriage, which was flanked by the retinue of knights who had protected her all of this time. They knew better than to get in the way of the young lady and her fiancé. Berengar hugged the little girl before seeing her off. However, the words she whispered into his ear caught him off guard. "I want you to know that even if you are with Lind, I will not stop fighting for your love." With that said, the little girl pecked him on his lips with her own before running away from his embrace and into her carriage, leaving Berengar stunned in silence as the caravan drifted off. He had a million thoughts racing across his mind as he watched Adela waving at him from the carriage in the distance. Chief among them was simply, "Am I really that bad at hiding my affair?" Despite realizing he was not as sly as he thought he was throughout this time, Berengar was happy that despite suspecting his illicit relationship with Lind, his little fiancé did not give up on marrying him. It would have been an unmitigated disaster if the girl had caught on to his actions and ended things after all of his efforts. As such, a wicked grin spread across his face as he stared into the clear blue sky above and voiced his thoughts aloud. Monogamy is for suckers. Berengar quickly returned to the castle after leaving his parting words for nobody to hear. He was not the type of guy to cultivate a harem. After all, trying to satisfy the emotional needs of more than 2 women was enough to drive any man to an early grave. However, if he could achieve it, he had more than enough love to spare for 2 beautiful ladies. As such, he was happy that things were progressing in the manner he intended. Things were going to be lonely now that Adela was gone, but with Lambert having been exiled and his family already aware of his relationship with Lind, he no longer had to hide his actions and could openly flirt with Lind and enjoy her company without having to sneak around all the time. Surely that would be a liberating experience. Apparently, Lind had the same idea, for the moment he entered the castle's doors, she jumped into his arms and began kissing him passionately. In between their kissing, Lind asked the question on her mind. So is the little girl gone?" Berengar flicked her on her forehead, which interrupted their passionate display, and chastised his lover. "Yes, but curiously she said something to me before she departed. Something unexpected." By the look on his face, Lind knew Adela probably mentioned something about their affair. As such, she acted innocently as if she had no idea what it could be about. As such, Berengar repeated what Adela had told him before narrowing his eyes and interrogating the young beauty. "So tell me, what exactly did you say to Adela about us?" Lind was caught off guard and blushed lightly as she tried to hide her embarrassment from Berengar. Ultimately, she had been caught. After being cornered like this, she had no option but to confess. "I may have said something along the lines of I would take good care of your fiancé while you were away." Berengar stared at Lind with a tyrannical expression before speaking the words on his mind. "You know what this means, right?" Lind nodded. Though she tried to hide it, she had an excited look in her eyes that told Berengar she had deliberately done this to be punished by him. Even if she enjoyed such a rough display of dominance, he would do exactly as she desired. As such, he dragged his lover into his room and spent the rest of his day punishing her severely for her actions which could have gone horribly wrong. For the first time in a long time, Berengar took a day off from work and merely spent it playing with his lover. If he were going to live a long and prosperous life, he would need to spend some days in such a manner. Chapter 66 Finding a Replacement. With Adela's departure, Berengar quickly found himself thrust into his work once more. He had to find an instructor to replace her as the teacher for Kufstein's children with her absence. Unfortunately, implementing his public education system was proving to be a slower endeavor than initially estimated. Because of this, he was currently interviewing a prospective candidate for the position Adela had left behind. The young man in front of him was one of the children of the late Marshal. Despite being responsible for the assassination of Marshal Friedhelm von Thierse, Berengar had successfully shifted the blame for the man's death onto his little brother, thus gaining the von Thierse family as a valuable ally. Currently, the second son of the family was sitting before Berengar. At the same time, the young regent conducted a thorough interview on whether or not the man could instruct the regent's children in basic education. The first matter of importance was determining whether or not the man understood the basic material. Over this past hour, Berengar had given the young man a basic arithmetic and language test, which the man passed with flying colors. Afterward, Berengar gave him the booklets that contained the learning materials that had been distributed to the students to see if he could thoroughly understand its content. The young man went by the name of Frederick, and he was relatively average-looking in all aspects. He was a studious and quiet man who perfectly exemplified the ideal of the noble scholar. Frederick shared the same dirty blonde hair and emerald eyes as his elder brother. The young man looked at Berengar with a passionate smile as he repeated a part of the social studies that contained Berengar's propaganda. The German people are a distinct ethnic group among the Germanic peoples who reside within the German-speaking regions of Central Europe. It should be the aim of every German to unify under a single cohesive empire free from foreign influence. Only by uniting with each other can the German people pursue their destiny of global hegemony. It was quite honestly a propaganda piece taken from the teachings of a certain regime from Berengar's previous life, yet if he was going to build an empire, the fatherland should be united as the core of it. Berengar had distributed a map for visual reference, which contained the regions he wished to incorporate into his future empire. This map was essentially an exact copy of the idea of a Greater Germany from a certain Austrian art student, with the addition of the Adriatic littoral and the Alpine foothills. After confirming that Frederick could teach the children, Berengar approached the man with a smile on his face and shook his hand. "It seems you are more than qualified to teach the children. You start tomorrow. I promise you will be paid a fair wage." The young man nodded his head in agreement and spoke his inner thoughts. "I'm just glad to be of service to the realm, my lord." Hearing such words, Berengar decided to celebrate and pulled out a flagon of beer while pouring it into 2 mugs he offered to the young man in front of him. "If you know anyone else who would be a good fit for the position, let me know. I want to expand public education across the entirety of the barony and need qualified instructors." Frederick smiled at Berengar and took out a list of names he had come prepared with for this very topic and handed it over to the young lord. Berengar was perplexed by this action, but he took a sip from his mug of beer while reading over the list of names. Most of the names written on the sheet of paper were from the younger generation of nobility, many of whom he had met at his engagement ceremony. Frederick smiled as he shared his thoughts with Berengar. "Many of the children of the nobility within the realm are fully educated and are inspired by your actions. They want to support you in any way they can, and since they are idling about in their homes wasting their lives away, I figured I could convince a few of them to take up teaching as a way to stem their boredom and be productive." Berengar's smile grew wider as he clasped Frederick on the shoulder and thanked the man for making such a list. "You have no idea how important this list is to me. I have had a challenging time trying to convince people to take up the position of a teacher. With this list in your aid, I can greatly expedite the process." Frederick grinned as he reveled in the compliments from the young lord. Now that Lambert was removed, those previously aligned against Berengar were either living in fear of his retribution or trying to suck up to him. Being from the family of one of Berengar's supporters, Frederick had received substantial benefits due to his elder brother's service. For starters, he was given priority in the field in which he desired to work. As a studious young man, Frederick was more than willing to teach his knowledge to the children and further his own studies from the materials in which Berengar provided. The 2 men continued to drink and chat for some time about Berengar's plans for the education of the realm. However, Berengar left out his imperial aspirations. It was evident by the map he had drawn and the propaganda in his social studies curriculum that he desired to be emperor. Knowing about all of the revolutionary innovations Berengar had invented and his benevolent character, Frederick could not help but support the young regent on his quest for power. Frederick had no way of knowing it at the moment. Still, one day he would become the Minister of Education for Berengar's Grand Empire, and it was at this moment that Berengar had gained another loyal and competent supporter. Together the 2 men would accomplish great things on the path to power. Berengar spent the remainder of his allotted time chatting with Frederick and building a valuable friendship. However, it would not be long before his duty called and he was forced to get back to work. For a tyrant there is never a moment of respite in his busy life. Chapter 67 Border Conflict. Ingbert was currently overseeing the transport of a shipment of steel and textiles to the Count of Steiermark, who resided in the city of Graz. He had just recently departed from the Barony of Kufstein and he was now sitting at the entrance of the town of Kitzbühel, the capital of the Barony of Kitzbühel, which was the barony which lay directly to the east of Kufstein and shared its border. The moment he had come close to the town of Kitzbühel while flying the banners of House von Kufstein, he had been stopped by the town guard with who he was currently engaged in a fierce debate. "Under whose authority do you dare to stop this trading caravan?" The man who had stopped him was dressed in a Brigandine breastplate and wore an iron bassinet helmet on his head. He currently had several archers and spearmen nearby holding the caravan captive. They all looked as if they were ready to unleash their fury at any moment. Clearly they were holding a grudge against the Barony of Kufstein. The man in charge sneered in disdain at Sir Ingbert as he answered the young man's questions. Under the decree of Baron Guntram von Kitzbühel, anyone who enters through the Barony of Kitzbühel through its western border shall be investigated for heresy. I hereby order you to stay within the confines of Kitzbühel until after the investigation is complete. In the meantime, we will be seizing all assets in which your caravan carries as potential evidence. If you are determined to be innocent of the charges, then all items seized shall be returned to you at the time of your departure. Ingbert was furious at the blatant disregard for his identity and lashed out at the guard. This is outrageous. The guard grinned wickedly at Ingbert and lowered his spear threateningly as he proceeded to taunt Ingbert. Any resistance will be considered a recognition of guilt, and thus we will be forced to execute you as a heretic. I suggest you hand over your weapons peacefully and come with us. Though Ingbert wanted to fight his way out, the town guard greatly outnumbered him and his caravan guards. As such, there was not much he could do about the current situation. All he could manage was to inform Berengar's spy network set up in Kitzbühel of this matter and have them relay the message to Berengar. As such, he was placed under confinement in the local tavern, where he quickly met up with the bar wench who worked for Berengar in secret and gave her the message. It would not be long before Berengar heard of the egregious actions of the Baron of Kitzbühel and demanded a response. Berengar sat upon his seat of power where Lind was kneeling before him, informing him of the events that had transpired to Ingbert and his caravan within the Barony of Kitzbühel. He slammed his fist on his armrest in a fit of fury and rose from his seat as he yelled at Lind. Preposterous! The Baron of Kitzbühel has no right to interfere with my trade. Clearly, he's doing this at the behest of the church as retaliation for my execution of those fucking inquisitors. That goddamn pious cunt, I swear to God I will get back to him for this. Though Berengar was screaming in anger, Lind did not mind. She liked this tyrannical side of Berengar. However, she kept her mouth shut and let him vent his anger. Berengar paced around the great hall as he contemplated on how to proceed. I want an envoy sent to Kitzbühel to mediate this grievance. I will not allow my business to be interrupted by that self-righteous prick. Lind frowned in dissatisfaction at Berengar's inaction and tried to goad him into violence as she approached his side and poked his chest tenderly. Why don't you send your armies? With the power of your forces, the Baron could not refuse your demands. Berengar knew what she was trying to do and pet her silky strawberry blonde hair before pulling her in close to her. You are a little vixen, you know that? No, I will not resort to violence over such a small matter. Besides, it would be just the justification your father needs to bring his armies down upon me if I did so. I would prefer to avoid war with the entirety of the Tyrolean forces if I could. There are too many of them. At best, I could withstand the siege until they yield, but by then, my businesses would be destroyed, and my people slaughtered. I will avoid violence until he gives me a proper casus belli. Lind pouted but ultimately accepted his decision. Not only was everything he said correct, but he knew that when Berengar made up his mind about something, there was no swaying him. As such, she rested her head on his shoulder and enticed him further. Hopefully, he does something to justify war. It is getting dreadfully boring around here now that I can no longer tease that little fiancé of yours. Berengar scoffed at Linda's reaction. This girl may be a masochist now, but that did not mean the entirety of her sadistic tendencies had disappeared. Clearly, she needed more training. However, he was busy at the moment and could not entertain his little pet. As such, he gave her a task to ease her boredom. I won't let Guntram get away with this. Reach out the cell in his land and have my hands burn down Guntram's granaries. Let him see what happens when he dares to provoke me. With this, Lind smiled mischievously. This was the ruthless and domineering tyrant who had stolen her heart. She was quick to obey his commands and set forth to task the local cell in Kitzbühel to engage in sabotage against the barony's food stores. It would not be long before this conflict escalated into an all-out war. When that occurred, Berengar would show what the thunder of a dozen 12-pound cannons could to the seemingly mighty walls of Guntram's castle. Years in the future, historians would come to recognize this as Berengar's first conquest and the beginning point in the rise of the German Empire. Chapter 68 Escalation of Force. In the dead of night, under the lack of illumination of the new moon, a group of individuals clad in dark clothing set forth from the town of Kitzbühel and began to engage in a sinister plot to burn the local granaries. With this act of sabotage, the people of Kitzbühel would lack food stored and be forced to purchase food from their neighbors to survive. Not only was this an act of retaliation from Berengar to Baron Guntram, but it was also a way to force Guntram to the bargaining table so that his shipment could be returned. As such, the individuals snuck in the darkness of the night around the granaries, which were guarded by a unit of the town guard. However, the men appeared to be half asleep at the moment and were having difficulties staying awake. This was because they had been to the tavern earlier that evening and drank wine mixed with a sedative, which the local tavern workers had provided to them. The entirety of the tavern staff was either directly or indirectly involved with Berengar's spy network. The saboteurs waited another 15 minutes before the men were completely unconscious. Afterward, they lit up a few torches they had brought with them and tossed them inside the granary. Before long, the majority of the town's food stores were lit ablaze, and the perpetrators had absconded into the night, never to be caught. By morning Baron Guntram von Kitzbühel was furious. He was not sure how, but this could only be the act of the regent of the neighboring barony, who else would have cause and conscience of engaging in such vile behavior. Currently, he sat with his council of advisors, who each had a different view on how to proceed further. His chancellor was the first to speak his concerns among the group of aging men. "This is clearly an act to bring us to the negotiating table. I say we comply before things get out of hand. We should return the shipment and allow his traders free passage through our lands under the condition that Kufstein compensates us for the loss of food stores. It is the only reasonable action." Guntram's marshal was of an entirely different opinion. He spat on the ground in disgust of the chancellor's opinion on the matter. "What we need to do is return this despicable action in kind. If we can torch their granaries, they will be in just as bad a situation as we are. Then they will think twice before provoking us further." Quickly the council chamber broke into bickering as none of Baron Guntram's advisors could agree on a solution. Ultimately the Baron pounded his fist on the table and made his decision known. "We will return this act of sabotage with one of our own. Not only will we burn down his granaries, but we will sabotage his steel factories in which he is so proud of. That way, we will hurt his trade far worse than simply seizing a shipment of steel and textiles." Though many of his advisors recognized that this might lead to an outright declaration of war, they could no longer sway their baron any further. As such, his decree was made, and his saboteurs were set to task. They would sneak into Kufstein in the night and engage in their criminal acts. It was now the dead of night, and once more, a group of black-clothed and masked individuals was up to no good. However, the shoe was on the other foot this time as these people quickly crossed the border and rode towards Kufstein under cover of darkness. However, unfortunately for them, Berengar was expecting an act of retaliation and had set his forces in the shadows in at the task to hunt down and eliminate the would-be saboteurs. The moment they stepped foot into Kufstein, their actions were already being closely monitored by Berengar's assassins. The town guard heavily guarded the industrial district, and as such, the saboteurs could not find a way to enter it unnoticed. Before long, the leader of the group exclaimed in defeat, "This is impossible. Why the hell does he have this place locked down like it is some fortress?" However, an unfamiliar voice came from the shadows, which immediately put him and his team on high alert. However, the origin of the voice was completely shrouded in the darkness. "Because His Majesty Berengar has many secrets to hide, kind of like these." The last thing the would-be saboteurs saw was a flash of blinding light as they heard the thunder of the guns echo in the night. Before they could even react, their bodies were torn to shreds by the revolving flintlock pistols of the assassins who had surrounded the saboteurs without their knowledge. These prototype weapons were issued to Berengar's spies and assassins and were based on the Collier revolving flintlock pistol from his previous life. Immediately the town guards were alerted and rushed to the sounds of the gunshots with their muskets loaded and ready for combat. However, when they arrived, they saw the corpses of the saboteurs riddled with musket balls, with no sign of the perpetrators. Half an hour later, Berengar was enjoying schnitzel and spätzle with a nice cold lager at the dinner table in which he ate by his lonesome despite it being well past midnight. His family was all asleep, though even if they were awake, it would not matter. Berengar had become accustomed to eating his meals with only Lynn to accompany him. However, she currently was not present. Unfortunately, Lambert's actions had devastated his family, and he had not seen Henrietta in weeks. However, according to her servants, she was still alive and eating the food brought to her. As for his mother, Gisela, she had secluded herself alongside Sigurd, where they continued to read the Bible. Berengar had given her to find some answer to the Lord's plan, and by extension, Lambert's sinful actions. At this moment, Lind approached with an excited expression, though the moment she saw Berengar was eating a midnight snack, which just so happened to be her favorite meal, she pouted like a child. "You could have told me you were eating, I would have surely joined you." Berengar chuckled as he finished his meal and wiped his mouth with his napkin before draining the remainder of his beer down his gullet. Afterward, he teased Lind with his response. "Too late now, S." This caused her to pout further, though eventually, she remembered her reason for seeking him out and gave him the good news. "Just as you had expected, Guntram sent men to sabotage the granary and the factories. Your hands assassinated them before they could cause any trouble." Berengar smiled wickedly as he grabbed Lind and pressed her into his embrace before kissing her passionately. "Excellent, everything is going as planned. As long as the violence keeps escalating, sooner or later, he will give me a valid casus belli for me to declare war on him. Hopefully, I don't have to wait long." With that said, he dragged his sly lover back to his room and enjoyed the rest of his waking hours training her. Chapter 69 Declaration of War. Berengar currently sat upon the seat of power within Kufstein, listening to his father's advisors squabble over trivial matters. He was beginning to gain the desire to blow his own brains out with one of his pistols if this dreadful conversation continued any longer. Throughout the past 2 weeks, Berengar had been engaging in a war of intrigue with his neighbor the Baron von Kitzbühel. What started as a simple seizure of assets under a bogus investigation quickly turned into repeated acts of sabotage, with Berengar getting the best of Guntram in every single encounter. At this point, Berengar was starting to get bored with how easy it was to best Guntram in the minor war of intrigue they were waging. Baron Guntram von Kitzbühel was a deeply pious man in his 40s who was an ardent supporter of the Church. He donated a significant sum to the Vatican each year as a show of his faith. In pursuit of justice on behalf of the Church, the man had foolishly been seizing Berengar's trade caravans and holding them for an extended time, while investigating the caravans for any heretical materials. By now, the man was sitting on a significant stockpile of steel and textiles that should have been delivered to their buyers during this time frame. Without the shipment of these supplies, Berengar's lucrative trade to the east of his lands was beginning to halt. Though on the surface Berengar had attempted to resolve these differences diplomatically, the reality was he was giving significant pressure to his rival behind the scenes. Of course, none of his agents' actions could be tied to him other than mere speculation. Baron Guntram had initially promised that after the supplies were thoroughly searched, he would allow them to pass through his borders. However, it had been 2 weeks since the man had first begun seizing his trade caravans, and Berengar was starting to lose his patience on this matter. If he could not resolve the issue soon, then he was sure to suffer heavy financial losses. However, merely seizing his goods and inspecting them was not a proper cause for war, and as such, Berengar could not force Guntram to return his assets. While spacing out in a daze of boredom, Berengar briefly overheard Eckerd's shouts as one of Berengar's spies rushed into the Great Hall and reported the situation to the new marshal. Baron Guntram did what? This is clearly an act of war. Berengar, with a look of confusion, as he was unaware of what had transpired and decided to confirm the situation. By the sound of it, it was bound to be good news. What is an act of war? Eckhard respectfully bowed before Berengar and reported the current situation at the border to his liege. "My lord, Baron Guntram has stated that he will be seizing your supplies indefinitely and donating them to the Church as compensation for the alleged crimes you have committed against Christendom. He also has begun executing the caravan guards, saying that they are heretics without providing any evidence to back his claims." Despite the horrific news, a sadistic grin spread across Berengar's face as he heard Eckerd's words. Finally, this was his chance to not only use force but lay waste to the pious cunt once and for all. As such, the young regent gave his decree immediately without any form of hesitation in his tone. "Eckhard, call the banners and rally the militia. If Guntram thinks he can execute men under my protection while robbing me like a common brigand, then he clearly underestimates my power." Aside from the local garrisons, I want the full military might of Kufstein deployed to the border as quickly as possible. Eckhard quickly pounded his chest in a salute. It will be done, my lord. With that, he quickly departed and began to rally the Barony of Kufstein's forces. The professional army in which his father had fostered had roughly 1,000 men among their ranks, and they would be fighting alongside Berengar's militia, which now numbered over 1,300 strong. If the Baron of Kitzbühel wanted war, then Berengar was more than happy to oblige. As such, Berengar quickly drafted an official declaration of war to deliver to Baron Guntram, which was then rushed to his territory by an official diplomat. Though Berengar's other advisors quickly swarmed around him and attempted to calm him down, in particular, his chancellor gathered by his side and chastised him for so quickly resorting to violence. My lord, do you believe it is wise to march upon the Barony of Kitzbühel? Baron Guntram has quite a large force of well-equipped professional soldiers, and while your father may have outfitted our troops with excellent supplies, that does not mean it will be easy to lay siege to his mighty castle. I beg you to rethink this recklessness and focus on diplomacy. Berengar sneered at his chancellor with disdain. What purpose did this man have to lecture him on the art of war? However, he refrained from doing anything unwise and merely scolded the man. Falco, I have been robbed of my people's labor. I will have satisfaction. The entirety of the Barony of Kitzbühel will more than make up for the assets which have been stolen from me. A look of horror spread across the chancellor's face as he quickly realized what the young regent meant by these words. You would lay claim to the baron's lands? Berengar's sinister gaze landed upon Falco and made him shiver in fright. The words the young regent spoke only furthered the dread in which the chancellor felt at that moment. My dear chancellor, my father is getting quite old. What kind of son would I be if I did not make him a viscount before he passes from this world? Berengar would use this excuse for war as a means to destroy Guntram's entire family and incorporate his domain into Kufstein. This would accomplish two of Berengar's ambitions, sending a clear message to his enemies that he should not be provoked, and expanding the borders of his family's dominion. While Falco gazed upon Berengar with a horrified expression, Berengar marched off to get himself equipped for battle. He would personally lead his forces into the Barony of Kitzbühel and lay waste to their army. The young regent could not help but think to himself as he dressed for the upcoming war. Finally, something interesting has happened. Chapter 70 Mustering the Army. Baron Guntram von Kitzbühel was currently sitting on his seat of power in his castle, drinking from a glass of water. The man was currently fasting as a sign of his dedication to the Lord and, as such, chose not to consume anything other than the natural liquid. Kneeling before him was a man from Berengar's domain that had ridden throughout the night to inform the Baron of Berengar's decision. The messenger handed the letter over to Baron Guntram with a concerned expression on his face. He did not know how the Baron would react to being declared war upon and certainly did not want to be executed for delivering such a message. Baron Guntram read through the contents of the letter with a serious frown across his face, which only increased the more he read. Dear Baron Guntram von Kitzbühel, I have received word that you have unlawfully seized my shipment to the Count of Steiermark, and as such, I consider you nothing more than a common brigand. By stealing from the labor of my people, I am entitled to compensation, and as such, I have decided that I will be taking your life, and that of your family, as well as your entire domain as recompense for your unlawful actions. Henceforth I Berengar, Regent of the Barony of Kufstein appointed as such by my father Baron Siegfried von Kufstein, openly declare war on the Barony of Kitzbühel and the House von Kitzbühel. May God have mercy on your soul, for I will not. Sincerely, Regent Berengar von Kufstein. Baron Guntram glared at Berengar's messenger with fury as he finished reading the message before thinking aloud. This boy would seriously go to war over something as trivial as seizing a small shipment of steel and textiles? Truly he is the spawn of Satan and must be eliminated for the greater good. Afterward, the man stood up from his seat of power and walked down its steps. He was a short and thin man with long graying hair. He was near as thin as Berengar was when he reincarnated into this world. Yet there was a fierce look of determination in his steel-blue eyes as he gazed upon the messenger. You may return to your master and tell him that he is a fool for declaring war on me, and I will return the favor by taking his sinful life. The messenger quickly nodded his head and spoke to the enraged baron. I will do as you have told me, my lord. Afterward, the man rushed off back to Berengar's domain as quickly as he could. On the other hand, Baron Guntram summoned his marshal, who appeared from behind the corner. He had been listening to the entire conversation from afar. Guntram quickly gave the marshal his decree. "Rally the troops, let us see what this would-be tyrant is made of, shall we?" A wicked grin spread across the marshal's face as he replied with excitement. "Aye, we shall." As such, Baron Guntram sat back on his seat and allowed the marshal to take command of his forces, where he would meet Berengar's armies on the field of battle before he could have the ability to lay siege to the heart of the Baron's domain. Berengar was currently sitting on the ground near a burning campfire. The full might of his militia had already been deployed to the border throughout the night. They were a force that could rapidly assemble. However, the same could not be said for the rest of his father's feudal forces and the vassals who commanded them. By now, only half of the barony's army had arrived. They were mostly equipped with a mixture of brigandine and plate while armed primarily with pikes. While marching alongside the incredibly advanced forces of Berengar's militia, the army looked as if it were a mixture of medieval, Renaissance, and early modern troops. It was truly a unique army in this world. The camps had been set up on the border between Kufstein and Kitzbühel, and Berengar was merely waiting for the arrival of the remainder of his forces, which should take no longer than a day. As he was camped out at the border, Berengar cleaned the sword in his hand, which was recently created and outfitted to his cuirassiers. It was an example of a 16th-17th century dusik. Essentially, it was the Renaissance equivalent of the infamous sabers, which would come to prominence throughout the cavalry forces of Europe and the Western world during the early modern period. In the hands of his cuirassiers, it was a deadly weapon and would wreak havoc across the many lightly armored feudal infantry that they were sure to fight against in the upcoming battle. Eckhard approached Berengar garbed in the Renaissance-style armor of the militia with his musket slung across his back. He took off his brass-trimmed burgonet as he sat down next to Berengar with an eager expression on his face. "The remaining forces should be here before nightfall. What are your orders?" Berengar nodded in response and began to smile at the news as he gave his commands. "Let the men rest. At first light, we march into the enemy's territory. I want the men to conduct themselves civilly, no raping or raiding, and no unnecessary murder. We will be ruling over these people soon enough, and I don't want any pointless grudges to be formed. Anyone who conducts themselves in such a manner will be sentenced for war crimes and executed by firing squad. Am I understood?" Eckhard nodded as he heard the words. He was truly getting old. With Berengar's command and his ethics of how warfare should be conducted, the savage ways of mass looting and after a successful siege would die out soon enough. The dawn of a new age of warfare was on the horizon, and the feudal powers of Europe would either have to rapidly adapt or bend the knee to the rising German Empire. Either way, the medieval period was on the edge of its lifespan. The two men continued to chat for some time before parting ways for their tents that night. When the dawn rose, the Barony of Kitzbühel would feel the wrath of a new era knocking down their door. Chapter 71 Cavalry Charge. The sound of the horn echoed throughout the campsite in which Berengar's forces had gathered, signaling it to be dawn, thus being time for the troops to rise from their tents. Berengar was already awake and taking care of his horse. It was a solid black destrier of noble stock. The beast was truly magnificent as its shining obsidian coat glistened under the rays of the rising sun. Berengar had named this horse Erwin after the famous German general from his previous life. The young regent had spent quite the sum acquiring such a magnificent steed for his warhorse, and as such, he tended to pamper the stallion. He quickly attached the steel plate barding onto the horse, which was blackened to match his armor and had brass trimming across it. Unlike normal cuirassiers, Berengar had elected to armor his horse appropriately. After all, he did not wish to lose such a majestic creature to the horrors of war. After attaching the armor to the horse, he climbed atop its saddle and waited for the men to muster. They would be marching soon enough into the enemy's territory and hopefully engage their army on the field of battle. Before long, his forces had gathered and loaded their muskets, setting the firing mechanism at half-cock so that they were prepared for battle at a moment's notice. As for the so-called professionals, they were appropriately equipped with primary pikes and swords as sidearms. The use of the pike was an innovation in which Berengar had equipped the standard infantry of his father's professional army after he rose to the position of regent. It did not take long for the infantry to become proficient in their use and formations, as it was far simpler to train a group of pikemen than it was to train musketeers, artillerymen, or cuirassiers. The armies marched together in the dawn under the banner of House von Kufstein. By the time they countered the enemy forces, they were merely a few kilometers away from the main town within the region. They were sandwiched between two sets of mountains and were in the valley below. However, they were still far from the enemy forces, which allowed Berengar's army time to get into formation. The artillery batteries rapidly set up the guns at an appropriate distance away from the battlefield where the armies were organized upon. The primary target of the artillery would be the archers and crossbowmen used by the enemy forces. If they could wipe them out before the infantries clashed, the casualties on Berengar's side would be greatly reduced. While his artillery got into position and loaded the 12 field guns, Berengar took charge of the cavalry, a mix of heavily armored knights and cuirassiers. There was roughly 110 cavalry in Berengar's army, which was far larger than the opposing forces. With 80 cuirassiers, each armed with a pair of pistols, they had the ability to engage the enemy knights with 160 shots, which was far more shots than necessary to eliminate the enemy knights. If fired at close range, it was more than enough to kill the riders or their horses. As such, his cavalry would be taking on the role of hunting down and destroying the enemy knights. As for the infantry, they were led by Eckhard and the appropriate officers under his command. The militia musketeers were an effective force capable of reloading their muskets in a matter of 7 seconds. They would approach the enemy forces while flanked by the pikemen, and open fire when they were within sufficient range to deal the most damage. Then the pikemen would protect them while they reloaded and fired again. If necessary, they could fix their bayonets and aid the pikemen in melee battle. This was the strategy with which Berengar had opted to go with. Once his forces were ready for battle, he ordered the march on the enemy position. Forward march. While covered by the echo of the thundering guns and their explosive shells, Berengar personally led the cavalry in a slow trot towards the enemy cavalry. They would begin the full charge once they were in the range of the enemy knights. Luckily, his cuirassiers were backed by the veteran knights. Considering they were the newest branch of his army and had yet to be tested in battle, it was good to have the knights alongside them under the circumstances. Before Berengar could even reach the enemy forces, the explosive shells of the artillery tore the lightly armored ranged forces of his enemy apart. Shrapnel filled the air, while the explosive blast shredded bodies, blood, and limbs flew across the field, creating a chaotic scene of death. The whistle of the shells in the air was all that could be heard before the detonation claimed the lives of their enemies. Already the enemy forces began to panic. They had never witnessed such a terrifying sight before. They thought to themselves that the wrath of God had descended upon them. Luckily, the marshal was a veteran of many battles and quickly rallied his troops. Hold the line, hold the line, he called off to the men of his army who were being picked apart by artillery fire. Nevertheless, while saying prayers to themselves, they marched towards the direction of Berengar's forces. A decision that would ultimately be their downfall. When the enemy knights spotted Berengar's cavalry rushing towards their position, they began a full-scale charge. With the heavily armored knights on their backs, the trotting of horses in steel barding was enough to install fear into any average soldier. Still, Berengar merely gazed upon them with a sinister smirk as he gave the order to his own cavalry forces. Charge! His cavalry forces greatly outnumbered the enemy's, and right when the two forces were about to clash with their lances, the 80 cuirassiers pulled out their pistols in both hands and pulled back the hammers on their flintlock mechanisms. The sound of 160 pistols going off in unison as their lead balls shredded the armor of the enemy knights was a spectacle to behold. In a single second, all but a few of the enemy knights fell from their horses, their lifeless bodies crashing against the ground like steel coffins. The remaining knights sat in shock upon horseback. However, they were completely run through by the enemy knights and their lances, ending their miserable lives before they could even react. Just like that, the battle had begun, and the most elite forces of the enemy were crushed beneath the heel of the Regent of Kufstein. Chapter 72 Overwhelming Victory. The thunder of 1,000 guns fired in unison echoed throughout the vicinity of the battlefield as the militiamen stood in their line formations a mere 20 feet away from the enemy infantry. The front line kneeled and aimed their muskets, while the second line stood above them with their muskets raised. Instantly, the massive amount of lead flying downrange decimated the enemy forces. At best, the infantry of the enemy was equipped with a Brigandine breastplate. However, such an obsolete piece of equipment could not protect the men wearing it from the devastating effect of the musket. As the militiamen quickly began to reload, The pikemen standing nearby rushed forward and defended them as they rapidly reloaded their weapons. During the 20 seconds it took to reload, a sturdy pike wall was set up in front of the enemy, who desperately tried to barge through and attack the men behind it. After witnessing the defeat of their cavalry, they had no choice but to go all out. As such, a frenzied charge began as men threw themselves at the pike wall in an attempt to break through. A single man clad in a mixture of brigandine and plate managed to storm past the pike wall with a sword in hand as the men around him were stuck like pigs by the massive length of the pikes. He quickly slashed at one of the militiamen who was reloading his weapon. However, before he could finish his attack, the militiaman dropped his activity and lifted his musket into the air with its bayonet affixed, stabbing directly into the open bassinet of the soldier who dared to attack him, instantly piercing through the man's eye and ending his life. Scenes like this appeared across the pike wall. Considering the importance of the militiamen and their hand cannons, the enemy's infantry did everything they could to prevent another volley from being fired off. After all, they doubted these men could quickly reload their weapons. Unfortunately for them, this was a miscalculation, as most of the lines were fully reloaded and ready to fire again within a matter of seconds. Before long, their weapons were once more aimed in the direction of their enemies, many of which had yet to recover from the shock of their front line being torn apart. The pikemen quickly fell behind the line of fire and waited for the second volley to go off. Within seconds the order to fire was given, and with Eckerd's command, another volley of thunderous gunfire riddled the enemy's lines. By now, much of the enemy force no longer dared to fight and began to rout. The enemy marshal looked in horror as he witnessed his lord's glorious army being gunned down in front of his very eyes. He had never before witnessed such an overwhelming defeat. Despite his forces being roughly on par with Berengar's in terms of numbers, they were quickly overwhelmed by the mysterious weapons in the hands of his enemy's well-trained soldiers. His knights were dead, his infantry's ranks were shattered, and what little remained of his archers had already begun to rout. As such, he quickly gave the command to retreat, as he yelled to whatever troops could still hear him. Fall back to the castle. Retreat." Unfortunately, his efforts were in vain, as soon after the marshal had given his command, Berengar's decree resounded throughout the air when he arrived with the cavalry, who instantly crashed into the routing forces, cutting them down in the process. Still, considering he was on horseback, the marshal managed to escape the field of battle, where he quickly fled back to the castle to inform his liege about the disastrous result of this battle. "Give no quarter." With that command, the musketeers quickly dropped their reloading process and engaged in a massive bayonet charge. Nearly 2,000 infantry armed with muskets which had their bayonets affixed and pikes quickly surrounded the routing forces of the enemy and reaped their lives away like wheat to the scythe. The horrific display of the chaotic battlefield was enough to make one's stomach churn. The enemy forces were quickly encircled and pierced in the weak points in their armor by bayonet and pike alike. Berengar slashed down from horseback with his saber, decapitating a soldier who was trying to attack him. He could not help but feel like this was where he was meant to be, leading his forces in a charge against his broken enemies. This was an absolutely humiliating loss to the Barony of Kufstein, whose surviving forces were quickly cut to ribbons. After defeating the enemy army, his troops broke out into cheers and celebrations. The enemy army had been annihilated, with only a pile of corpses remaining from their ranks. Due to the archers being decimated at the start of the battle, and the heavy cavalry taken out early on, the most serious injury was some minor lacerations caused by the brave souls who were lucky enough to get past the pike wall. If this had been a larger army he was forced to fight, Berengar was unsure if he would get the same results. However, against an army of equal size, the weapons and tactics Berengar employed were too advanced for his enemy to even contend with. The men within the ranks of the professional army were stupefied beyond belief at how effective the muskets were. These were obviously not ordinary hand cannons. If not for the fact that they were veteran soldiers with plenty of experience, they may have failed in their duty to protect the militiamen while they reloaded due to shock. Berengar, on the other hand, was impressed with the performance. Once more, his victory was overwhelming. Who in this feudal era could contend with the power of steel and shot? While his troops were cheering, he reloaded his pistols while Eckhard approached him. "Congratulations on another overwhelming victory, my lord." Berengar smiled and accepted the gesture before staring down at Eckhard, who stood below his mighty steed. "We may have won the battle, but the war is still waging. Get the army on the march. I want a siege camp built outside their castle walls before dusk." With his orders being given out, the army quickly began to march into the nearby town, where they would begin the lengthy process of laying siege to the enemy's remaining forces hiding cowardly behind the castle's walls. Chapter 73: Establishing a Siege Camp. The enemy marshal had made it back to Baron Guntram and informed him of his massive defeat before the enemy forces had arrived in the town of Kitzbühel. Baron Guntram could not believe his ears as he listened to the near-fantastical tale of how easily his armies were torn apart by Berengar's forces and the thunderous weapons they wielded. "My liege, our armies are defeated. The survivors of our forces are few in numbers and have already begun to flee the land. It will not be long before the enemy has us surrounded, and we are besieged. Tell me, sire, what are your orders?" Baron Guntram was still shocked by the news and truly did not know how to react to this situation. The best he could do was hope his walls could withstand the cannon fire of Berengar's artillery. After all, surely his marshal was exaggerating their effectiveness? After regaining his senses, Guntram gave his decree. "I want every man and child capable of bearing arms atop these castle walls defending it with their lives. If you have to, send the garrison into the village to gather the forces necessary to achieve this, and do it swiftly before the enemy arrives." For once in his life, the marshal wished his liege would sue for peace. Unfortunately, he could not voice such concerns as his orders were already given. As such, the man quickly gathered the castle's forces and rode into the village, conscripting anyone capable of bearing arms into their forces to defend the castle's walls. It did not matter if they had never used a bow before. Simply having the bodies necessary to launch missile fire at the enemy attackers was good enough for the Baron, who had grown desperate after his recent defeat. Berengar rode atop the back of his mighty steed as he and his forces marched into the town of Kitzbühel. The local castle lay in the hills above, overlooking the valley and the people within it, displaying the authority of the mighty overlord of the region. Berengar had no time to spare with securing the township and merely ordered his troops to move through it so they could set up a siege camp within the vicinity of the castle. Sieges were long-lasting endeavors, but he figured he could bring down the large stone walls fairly quickly due to his superior firepower. As such, he barked commands at his troops who heeded his commands. "I want a siege camp set up and fully fortified by dusk. Make sure it is out of the range of enemy missile fire." Eckhard, who was marching in command of the infantry forces, quickly pounded his breastplate as he saluted Berengar while responding to his orders. "It will be done, my lord." The local townsfolk who remained after the massive conscription which had just taken place quickly fled their homes as they saw the army arrive. They were frightful of the potential actions which the enemy forces would take against them now that their own had been defeated in the field of battle. Many women and children wept for the loss of their husbands, fathers, and sons, who were torn to shreds by the overwhelming might of Berengar's forces. Very few of the Baron's soldiers had escaped the wrath of their enemy. Those who were lucky enough to survive had begun to flee with their families towards one of the other villages in the barony. After witnessing the frightening display of their enemy's power, they had no hope in rallying behind the castle walls and successfully defending against the siege. Berengar made sure his men were fully disciplined as they marched through the village. He had made it abundantly clear to his men beforehand that the people of this region were not to be mistreated, and as long as his watchful eye cast over them, they managed to behave themselves. Whether they would be able to maintain this degree of professionalism during a protracted siege was a different story. Berengar set his siege camp up just out of range of the enemy defenders. However, Berengar's forces were still in range of attack, and as such, they could successfully bombard the enemy defenders with cannons and rifles throughout the entire period. The effective range was essentially a mere 300 feet, and their longbows had a maximum range of 328 yards. Even the once mighty steel crossbow had a mere 380 yards of effective range. In comparison, the effective range of Berengar's cannons was roughly 1,618 yards. His long rifles, while in the hands of effective marksmen, were roughly 500 yards in range. As such, by placing their siege camp roughly 400 yards away from the enemy castle, they were able to effectively attack their enemy from dawn to dusk without a single enemy attack on their forces. It took quite some time, however. The siege camp was fully set up and effectively fortified by the evening. The guns had been loaded and begun their bombardment. They would not stop until the next morning. The Napoleon-style 12 pounds cannon was already a sturdy and robust cannon design in his previous life, mostly made of bronze. However, Berengar's cannons were made of high-quality steel, and as such, could withstand the pressures of a steady firing rate throughout the night. As such, the thunder of guns echoed throughout the entirety of the night while the 12-pound solid steel cannonballs battered the mighty stone walls of the enemy's castle, slowly chipping away at the enemy's defenses. Those defenders unfortunate enough to get caught in the blast were torn apart by the enemy bombardment. Stone shards constantly spat out the areas affected by the continued bombardment and acted as shrapnel against the defending forces. Though it was only 12 guns, they were able to effectively bombard the enemy defenders to the point of suppressing them completely. Even if they were within firing range of the defenders, those who lie behind the castle walls would not be able to cause much harm upon their foes. The might of steel and shot had shown itself as Berengar sat in his tent drinking from a goblet of wine. Tomorrow he would allow the cannoneers to rest and give his enemy a slight reprieve. He would resume his bombardment the following morning. Chapter 74 Throw them to the wolves. The dawn had risen, and Baron Guntram and his family had not been able to get a wink of sleep. Instead, they were huddled in the great hall listening to the near-constant thunder of guns while shivering in fear. Baron Guntram's 2-year-old daughter was particularly frightened by the thunder that echoed throughout the night and held onto her father's hand firmly. "Daddy, I'm scared." The look on Baron Guntram's face was not reassuring. After all, in his declaration of war, Berengar had promised to show no mercy to Guntram or his family. If the walls crumbled and the enemy forces rushed into his keep, there was no chance of survival. As such, he had begun to regret his decision to provoke Berengar in the name of the church. Why was God testing him in such a manner? What had he done to deserve this fate? Those were the questions the pious nobleman asked himself as the echoes of the cannons continued to bombard his castle. However, shortly after praying to the Lord, the thunder of the guns had ceased. After waiting nearly half an hour for the bombardment to resume, there was still only silence from his enemies. As if his prayers had been answered, Guntram rushed outside to see for himself what was transpiring. After standing atop the walls, which had been greatly diminished by the night of bombardment, he could see the besieging forces standing idly by in their siege camp below. He could not help but wonder if they had run out of munitions. At the next moment, a small lead projectile whizzed past his face, and the thunder of the rifle which had fired it echoed in the distance. He quickly ducked below the ramparts and hid from the enemy fire. Just what kind of weapon was that? Seeing that his men were cowering in fear beneath the protection of the walls, he could not help but empathize with their pain. As such, he quickly returned to the keep, where he hid with his family once more, though the cannons may have stopped the hand cannons in which the enemies used posed a significant threat to anyone stupid enough to expose themselves. Berengar was currently standing in the middle of his siege camp in front of 3 men who were stripped of their arms and armor and currently wearing nothing more than the gambeson they wore beneath it. These 3 men were of his father's forces, and they were currently bound and kneeling in front of him. During the night, these men had abandoned their posts and raided the local town. They had even raped a local teenage girl who was ever so slightly older than Adela, which Berengar found disgusting and unforgivable. However, they did not pull this off on their lonesome. Clearly, there were other people involved. However, only these 3 men were caught, and they were not willing to rat out their brothers in arms. Berengar strode back and forth in front of the men and glared menacingly at them. His fury exuded from the very depths of his soul as he lectured the surrounding army, which was forced to bear witness to this scene. "I have made my orders very clear. The local population are not to be harmed, and yet the 3 of you have disobeyed my orders. You abandoned your posts in the night to engage in raiding, raping, pillaging, and burning while flying the colors of my family. Do you have any idea how this makes me look, as the lord and commander of this army?" Standing next to Berengar was the little girl on which the 3 men had preyed upon. Her family had remained in the region, along with a few of the more stubborn families who did not wish to leave their homes behind. After Berengar had heard about their crimes, he instantly had the men arrested and interrogated. Unfortunately, they were quite resilient and did not rat out any other members of his father's forces who had acted in a similar manner. As such, Berengar was left with no further options and had gathered his army and the villagers alike to witness the upcoming scene. Berengar spat in disgust on the men bound before him and boldly declared for all to hear. As regent of the Barony of Kufstein, and commander of this army, I hereby find you 3 men guilty of war crimes and sentence you to death by firing squad. May God have mercy on your souls. As such, Berengar motioned for his militia to drag the 3 men away to a safe area where they would publicly execute the soldiers. While the men were tied up to posts and prepared for their execution, Berengar addressed his armies with a vicious gaze. Any one of you who is guilty of engaging in this activity in the future will be afforded the same punishment. I come to these lands as a conqueror, but that does not mean my army will act like a bunch of brigands. You will obey my orders, or you will face the consequences. The members of his militia were fully disciplined in the manner in which Berengar desired to conduct war. Against enemy forces, Berengar would allow virtually any use of force. He was also not afraid of civilian casualties if they were caught in a bombardment or assault of an enemy's position. His ruthlessness in his pursuit of victory could be considered war crimes by the standards of the 21st century in which he resided during his past life. However, as far as Berengar was concerned, raiding, raping, murdering, and other crimes of the like which deliberately targeted unarmed civilian populations were absolutely unforgivable, especially when enacted against those he deemed to be children. Unfortunately for him, these things were common in this feudal era, especially during sieges, and his father's professional forces did not take his warnings seriously. Berengar comforted the girl who had been violated by the men in his father's army as he crouched down and got into her line of sight. I know that no apology I could give you can make up for the crimes that you have endured under my watch. However, I hope you can find solace in the fact that justice has been dealt to the perpetrators. With this said, Berengar returned his attention to the public execution and motioned for it to proceed. The criminals were tied to posts, and a proper firing squad of 12 men was formed as they raised their muskets. Eckhard personally gave the commands that led to the deaths of these men who were guilty of doing nothing more than what was a common occurrence in this primitive era. Ready, aim, fire. With the last command given, the thunder of the muskets echoed as their projectiles shredded the bodies of the men who were tied against posts and ended their miserable existence. Many of the soldiers from his father's army were shocked and outraged at Berengar's action. Until the moment it transpired, they truly believed Berengar was just bluffing in an attempt to scare them into following his ludicrous ideas of civility in warfare. The last orders Berengar gave before the gathered crowd would act as a permanent reminder to the men under his command as to the ruthlessness Berengar would enact upon those who failed to follow his orders. Throw them to the wolves. With that said, the criminals' corpses were cut down from the posts and left to rot in the wilderness. Under Berengar's orders, they were not even afforded a proper burial. Chapter 75 Suing for Peace. The remainder of the day was spent intimidating the garrison hiding behind the deteriorating stone walls of the castle. Berengar had tasked his militia to keep an eye on his father's professional forces and report any suspicious activity to their NCOs. After the events that transpired during the previous night, Berengar was far more cautious about the behavior of the men beneath his command. Luckily for him, his message was obvious, and the knights and men-at-arms who comprised of his father's forces were thoroughly intimidated into following orders. They knew the militia were loyal completely to Berengar, and they did not have a chance of surviving if they mutinied. As such, the night was far more peaceful than the previous one. As for Baron Guntram and his forces, they continued to hide behind their walls, praying that Berengar's forces no longer had the capacity to bombard them. Unfortunately for them, when the sun rose the next day, the bombardment continued. The solid steel balls constantly battered the stone walls, and slowly but surely, they began to crumble. It was not until noon when the gates of the castle were opened, and a man dressed in knightly plate armor wearing the colors of House von Kitzbühel walked out from the entrance flanked by several guards. In his hands was a white flag of peace. After noticing this, Berengar ordered his artillery to cease their bombardment, grabbed a white flag of his own, and marched with his grenadier to meet up with the man he presumed to be Baron Guntram von Kitzbühel in between the siege camp and the castle. When Berengar finally arrived in front of Guntram, the man sighed heavily. He knew his castle walls would not hold out for long, the damage done to them would already cost a fortune to repair, his armies were defeated, his conscripts did not have the means to defend the castle any longer, and he was waiting for the end of himself and his family. At least this way he could negotiate with Berengar for the survival of his family. I have come to negotiate the terms of my surrender. Currently, Berengar and his grenadier stood across from Guntram and his houseguard. The scene of the early modern force, standing across from their medieval counterparts, would one day be painted brilliantly and become a staple of German culture. The painting would be titled, "When Two Worlds Collide," and would display the overwhelming might of Berengar's rise to power. Of course, neither of the two men knew such a thing would occur in the distant future, and as such, they merely conducted themselves appropriately. Berengar grinned at Guntram, though he had stated he would act ruthlessly towards the arrogant Baron and his family during his declaration of war. It was all part of his negotiations. After all, the cost of rebuilding the castle and the resistance that would come to a new dynasty placed in authority by him was not something Berengar wished to deal with. What he wanted was Guntram's subservience to subject him and his territory as a vassal state and to raise his family's status to a viscountcy as such. Berengar spoke with the authority and tyranny of a conqueror who would not accept anything other than an unconditional surrender. "State your terms." That is all that Berengar said as he looked coldly upon the once mighty Baron. This confused the man, but Guntram tried to appear as if he was negotiating from a position of strength. "I will give you back your steel and textiles. I will also offer you compensation for the cost of this war. In return, I want you and your men to leave this land and my family in peace." Berengar gazed at Guntram seriously before breaking out into laughter. After a few moments of awkwardness, he calmed himself down before saying his piece. You must be joking. You realize that if we continue as things are, your walls will collapse, and my men will storm your castle. At that point, I really will not spare you or your family's lives." Guntram frowned at this response. He did not have a proper retort. He knew he could not effectively defend his keep for much longer. This was an overwhelming victory for Berengar, and Guntram did not have the means to enforce his demands. As such, he asked Berengar in a slightly agitated tone, "What is it that you desire from all of this?" Berengar moved closer to Guntram, which immediately alerted his guards. However, he maintained enough distance to maintain a degree of civility. "What is it that I desire, you ask? I want you to accept your position as my family's vassal. I want to incorporate your territory into Kufstein and for my family's lands to be recognized as viscountcy with all of the status and prestige that comes with it. Now I can take this land by force, but in my opinion, there has already been enough bloodshed. You have two options. You can return to your castle and wait for your death alongside your family. Or you can submit to my rule and live to maintain your land under my sovereignty. It is time to choose." With Berengar's demands having been made, Guntram was left with an ultimatum, one in which he knew Berengar could fully enforce. Either way, Kitzbühel would be incorporated into Kufstein. His choice would merely determine whether or not he and his family would live to preside over it. Being backed into a corner by the young regent, Guntram had no choice but to accept Berengar's conditions. "Under these terms, I surrender to you, my lord." Berengar smiled as he clasped Guntram on the shoulder as if he were an old friend before saying his piece. "Swear fealty unto me, and I will accept your surrender." Begrudgingly Guntram kneeled before Berengar and spoke the oath of fealty. "I, Baron Guntram von Kitzbühel, promise on my faith that I will in the future be faithful to the Viscount of Kufstein, never cause him harm, and will observe my homage to him completely against all persons in good faith and without deceit." With these words spoken, the war that would be known to all in the future as the First Kufstein Border War was concluded, with Berengar and his family ascending to the title of Viscounts and doubling the territory under their dominion. This would be the first of many conquests the Tyrant of Steel would engage in on his path to becoming emperor. Chapter 76 Endorsement of Theft. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, Berengar was tasked with incorporating Kitzbühel into his family's domain and going through the necessary procedures to declare his father Sigurd as the Viscount of Kufstein. Word quickly spread of Berengar's rapid conquest of the neighboring barony, and the other feudal lords were left scratching their heads wondering how Berengar had managed to effectively force the Baron of Kitzbühel to surrender in under a week. Of course, as per the terms of surrender, Baron Guntram and his surviving men were incapable of leaking information regarding Berengar's advanced weapons and tactics to anyone. As such, numerous theories came to be on how Berengar had achieved such a feat. Count Lothar, who was Berengar's liege, was unhappy with the news. With Berengar's conquest, he had lost a direct vassal. However, there was not much he could do about the situation as he was aware of his daughter's relationship with the young Viscount and had no way to punish him without gaining her disapproval. As a man tightly controlled by his desires to please his daughters, he dreaded such an outcome. As such, Count Lothar quickly recognized the results of the war and recognized Sigurd as the Viscount of Kufstein, even if he was currently still officially secluded in penance. Berengar was swamped with work. Not only did he have to provide proper compensation to the families who were affected by his men's war crimes, but he also had to incorporate many of his agricultural technologies into the new land. On top of this, he was spreading his propaganda to the people of Kitzbühel, who already had a fairly positive image of him after he executed the criminals in his ranks. While Berengar was managing the affairs of two whole baronies now, Lind was hard at work expanding the spy network. She did not idly laze about while Berengar was off at war. She had made quite some progress in establishing new cells throughout the nearby counties. She refused to be a pretty face for her man to make love to and instead supported Berengar in the best way she could. Currently, she was at the tea shop where she normally conducted business with the local speaker, who just so happened to be Ludolf, the deacon of the local church. The man was close to becoming a fully ordained priest and was beginning his path to the reformation of the church. "So, how is the sovereign?" Lind drank from the tea in her cup as she entertained her subordinate's small talk. "He's doing quite well. However, he is currently swamped overseeing the incorporation of the new territory, and as such, I have been rather lonesome." Though Ludolf suspected Berengar and Linda's relationship, he really did not inquire about it, as he did not wish to know the personal life of Berengar, who he viewed as a complicated man, one who was blessed by God and destined to lead the German people to a bright future but had a fair share of vices that he felt uncomfortable with. One thing was certain, Berengar was no saint. Ludolf passed over a letter on the table he had copied from the head priest's files before speaking in a hushed tone. The church is officially condemning Berengar's actions to invade and annex Kitzbühel. They are calling upon the local lords to form a defensive pact. If he makes another move, he will be beset upon from all sides by his enemies. Lind scoffed as she placed down her teacup and looked at the letter in his hands. After reading it, she placed it down with disgust. The church truly wanted to make things difficult for Berengar. In this letter, the church openly demanded that the assets seized by Guntram be handed over to the church as they had already been promised as such by Guntram, and as far as they were concerned, legally seized. This created an area of conflict with Berengar's trade routes, as they were encouraging other regions to do the same. It is not as if Berengar had the power to go to war with every region that stole the product of his people's labor. Lind sighed heavily as she came to an unwanted conclusion about how to resolve these troublesome matters. "I suppose I will have to contact that little girl." Ludolf looked at Lind with a gaze of confusion as he heard the irritation in her voice. Though he felt like he should not pry into her business, his curiosity got the better of him. "What little girl?" Lind snorted in displeasure. She felt uneasy just thinking about it, but now that the church was instigating theft of Berengar's supplies, she had no option but to get her father and the father of her rival to work together to counteract the church's influence. "Berengar's adorable little fiancé. If I can get Adela to convince her father to condemn the church's actions, two counts will publicly oppose the Vatican and their open endorsement of theft. The threat of the armies of two counts will be more than enough to dissuade anyone foolish enough to try to seize Berengar's resources." Ludolf nodded in agreement. What she said made sense. He could tell by Linda's frustrations that she was not particularly fond of Adela, and as such, he felt that his suspicions were confirmed. Nevertheless, he decided to try to mediate their conflict and suggested an alternative option. Why not get Berengar to ask for assistance? That way, she is more likely to comply. Lind shook her head as she expressed her concerns. "Berengar will never ask Adela for help. He's too proud to ask for her father's assistance in the matter. This is something that I will have to do personally. I only hope she's willing to read my letter instead of burning it the moment she sees my family's seal upon it." Ludolf decided to steer away from this conflict among maidens after all and merely drank from his tea. He could tell by that statement alone that the two girls would likely never see eye to eye. Of course, in his eyes, it was obviously Berengar's fault for being greedy and wanting two beautiful young women by his side. Nevertheless, he somewhat envied Berengar, but as a man dedicated to God, he quickly squashed such notions before getting up from his seat. "I will leave the remainder of the task to you. I have to get back to the church." With that, Ludolf disappeared into the crowd, leaving Lind by her lonesome as she contemplated the best words to plead for Adela's assistance. Chapter 77, a fitting name. Berengar currently sat in the dining room. The only two people present for this morning's breakfast were Berengar and Lind. As usual, his family was still fractured after Lambert's conviction. Berengar had not seen his father's or his sister's face in some time. Though Sigurd was officially declared a viscount, and his territory had doubled, he was officially in isolation for penance. The good news about this was that Berengar could openly flirt with Lind without getting the stink eye from his fellow family members. As Berengar snacked on a breakfast sandwich, he noticed the blue eyes of his darling little sister peering out from the corner of the entryway. Evidently, the little girl was spying on him and Lind. Though Berengar wanted to go over and greet her, he feared she would fly back to her room the moment she noticed she was spotted, like a scared little rabbit. As such, he continued to have a civil conversation with Lind about managing the realm's affairs. "Has your father guaranteed safe passage for my trade routes within the county of Tyrol?" Lind was gracefully dining on an omelette while she nodded her head. She only began to speak after she had swallowed her bite. "Of course, my father will do whatever I tell him to do. He dotes on his daughters far too much." Berengar smiled and decided to shift the conversation to something more personal. After a few moments of silence, he finally asked in an awkward manner, "So, what should we name the child?" This line of questioning instantly piqued Henrietta's curiosity, which was not so subtly listening in on the conversation. On the other hand, Lind wiped her mouth with her napkin before putting a gentle smile on her doll-like face. "If it's a boy, I was thinking of naming him after his father." Berengar smiled sadistically as he responded to her idea while she took a drink from her goblet of water. He could not help but tease his lover when the two of them were alone. Even if Henrietta was watching, he did not mind embarrassing the poor lass. "Oh, so you plan on naming him Lambert?" Lind nearly spat out her drink as she heard those words. She struggled to contain the liquid as she swallowed it down. After doing so, her face shifted into a furious glare as she scolded Berengar for his behavior. "Don't even joke like that. You know I meant to name him after you." This news was shocking to Henrietta as she listened to Lind admit that her child was Berengar's. This invoked the inner fury of Henrietta as she already blamed Lind for Lambert's exile. Considering she was so young, Henrietta was not told that Lambert had attempted to kill Berengar. Instead, she was told that he voluntarily chose to join the Teutonic Order after changing his heart about his marriage with Lind. She may be young, but Henrietta was no idiot. She suspected something was going on between Berengar and Lind for quite some time, and now that it was confirmed, she was furious at the two of them. However, despite the little loli's inner fury, she continued to listen to the conversation between the scandalous couple. Berengar, of course, was not fond of any of his children being named after him. He did not want a Berengar II chipping away at the legacy he envisioned himself building in this world. He wanted people in the future to know and revere the name Berengar and immediately associate it with himself, much like they did to the name Alexander, which belonged to the world's greatest conqueror. As such, he came up with an alternative, one which was very dear to him as a man who had lived two lives. It was his father's name from his past life. As such, Berengar looked at Lind with a tender expression and grabbed a hold of her hand as he tried to convince her to name the child after his father from his past life. "If it is a boy, how about we name him Hans? That name once belonged to someone very dear to me." Though Lind did not know who Berengar was referring to, by the look on his face, it was a bittersweet memory at best, and as such, she did not pry for information. She did not dislike the name, and as such, quickly agreed. A fitting name, but what if it is a girl? Berengar did not even need to think about it. He would name it after his mother from his previous life if it were a girl. "Then we will name her Helga." Both of these names were acceptable to Lind, and as such, she smiled and nodded her head as she accepted the terms. "That sounds good to me." After hearing these things, Henrietta finally revealed herself with a pouting expression. She did not like that Lind was getting all of the attention from Berengar and quickly jumped into his lap while staring down Lind with a furious gaze. Berengar was taken aback by this action as Henrietta had not done such a thing in many years. Thus he felt slightly uncomfortable as she looked up at him with a pitiful expression. "Big brother, you have not come to visit me in so long." Berengar did not know how to react to this. Indeed, he did not visit her while she was hiding away in her room and opted to give the little girl some space. However, he was dreadfully busy over the past few weeks managing the entirety of the realm, and as such, had no means to do so. He felt that he had no option but to pet her head and show her some affection, which he did as he chastised the girl for her behavior. You know Adela left, right? She was quite sad that you did not bid your farewells. A distraught expression appeared on Henrietta's face as she realized she was too depressed to say farewell to her friend and began to slam her tiny fists into Berengar's chest as she threw a childish tantrum. Why didn't you tell me? Berengar chuckled lightly before restraining the girl. Don't worry, her birthday is coming up soon, and we will go pay her a visit. Henrietta finally calmed down when she heard those words and began to smile for the first time in a long time. Just like that, Berengar spent the rest of his breakfast time doting on his little sister, much to the ire of Lind, who sat silently and ate her meal. Chapter 78 Lambert's Decision. Lambert was currently in the courtyard of the castle of Malbork, where he was currently undergoing the brutal training to which the initiates of the Teutonic Order must adhere. Currently, he was sparring with many of his fellow initiates. The young men wielded blunt steel swords against one another as they fearlessly tried to gain the upper hand against their fellow initiates. Joining the Teutonic Order was not the honor it had been centuries ago. In the eyes of the public outside of the German-speaking regions, they were seen as warmongers, spreading the views of Catholicism to the neighboring Orthodox kingdoms by the tip of the spear. An action that greatly strained the relations between the two pillars of Christianity. Currently, the Teutonic Order was in a war with the Grand Duchy of Moscow and, by extension, the Golden Horde, who were the Muscovites' feudal overlords. A war in which they were faring quite well. However, the need for new troops was constant, and as such, the Teutonic Order had begun taking in criminals as an attempt to fuel their endless crusades in the north. As such, Lambert was engaged in a sparring session with another initiate. The young man was an orphan adopted by the Teutonic Order many years ago and had been training within the castle for quite some time. Though he was talented, Lambert was far superior in the art of swordsmanship and easily bested the man as he dropped him to the floor with a murder stroke. After knocking the man to the ground, Lambert looked upon him with disdain before barking orders. Get up. However, the moment he did so, he felt a thump on the back of his head from the Master of Arms of the Teutonic Order, who quickly chastised him. Initiate, you do not give orders to your brothers, nor do you use such force against them in a mere sparring session. As punishment for your actions, you will be cleaning the latrines after your training is over. By now, Lambert knew better than to protest. Despite being a man of noble birth, none of that truly mattered in the Teutonic Order. To every knight within this castle, he was considered nothing more than a criminal and a meager initiate who had yet to earn the right to bear the Black Cross of the Order. As such, Lambert merely nodded before getting back to sparring. Throughout the remainder of the session, he vented his frustration onto his sparring partners, resulting in the other young men greatly dissatisfied with Lambert and his unruly behavior. This past month, since the boy had begun his exile, he had suffered constant humiliation at the hands of the established knights and had been greatly humbled in his duties. He hated every moment of his time spent here while blaming his brother and his ex-fiancée for his current circumstances. The only thing keeping him sane was the thought that one day he would gain his vengeance against those who had wronged him. After the sparring session, Lambert began to clean out the latrines. It was an exceptionally filthy and degrading task, but it was a fitting punishment for his behavior. Lately, he had spent a lot of time doing menial tasks such as this. Though he was by far the most talented of the new initiates, his attitude made him unpopular and unlikely to make any new friends anytime soon. After finishing cleaning the latrines, he was approached by a couple of knights. The one in command immediately gave him a summons. You have been summoned to the Great Hall. I suggest you make yourself presentable before you meet the Grand Master. Without allowing him time to reply, the knights turned around and left. They had fulfilled their duties and no longer cared about what happened to the boy. Whether or not he heeded their advice was entirely up to him, and they had no desire to aid such a disorderly initiate any further than necessary. Thus Lambert took a bath and put on a clean set of initiate's attire before approaching the Great Hall of the mighty castle. After entering the Great Hall, he saw the Grand Master standing near the fireplace, reading a letter contained within his hands. This letter was from the Vatican and informed him of the many alleged misdeeds of Berengar since the young man had taken over the role of regent in his father's lands. When Lambert approached the Grand Master, the man turned around and stared at him intensely in silence. The Grand Master was an older man in his 60s. He was completely bald, with a large white beard and steel-gray eyes. He wore a set of plate armor in the appropriate style of the era with a white tabard on top of it, which had the golden and black cross of the Grand Master emblazoned upon it. The man looked at Lambert with a stern expression as he greeted the boy. So you are the second son who tried to murder his elder brother for the inheritance? It is a pity you failed. Your brother has turned into a thorn in the church's side. Because of that, I just received a request from the Pope to invade your family's lands and annex them as a part of the Teutonic state. Lambert stood in shock as he heard this news. He did not know what events had occurred to his brother after he was exiled, but the Inquisition should have arrived by now. However, the fact that the Holy See had requested the Teutonic Order's intervention meant something extraordinary had happened over the past month. Lambert could not prevent himself from inquiring about the details. What happened? The older man placed down the letter in his hands on his desk and grabbed a chalice filled with wine as he began to drink from it. It was only after he had chugged the entire contents of the glass did he reveal the details of what had transpired. Your brother has killed 2 members of the Inquisition. Afterward, he was excommunicated and declared a heretic, an action that should make a man think twice before engaging in any further wicked behavior. Yet I just received word that he has unlawfully invaded and annexed one of his neighbors, declaring his father a viscount under the newly established Viscounty of Kufstein. If that were not bad enough, the Baron of Kitzbühel had promised a substantial degree of raw materials to the Vatican as a gift. Your heretic of a brother has now seized those resources, and he refuses to relent on the issue. If the Church was good at one thing, it was propaganda, and in an area so far away from Berengar's influence, the only news about his actions came from the Church. They did their best to paint him as a villainous fiend whose very nature was antagonistic to the Church and their teachings. The Grand Master was completely unaware of the truth behind these events and, as such, chose to believe his master's lies. After hearing the events that had occurred over the past month in his family's lands, Lambert struggled to find the means to express himself, and in his brief moment of silence the Grand Master closed the distance between the two and gazed at him with a grave expression. At the moment, I do not have the men to spare to fulfill the Pope's request. However, that will not be an issue within a matter of months, so the question on my mind is simply this. Are you going to continue to throw a tantrum like a small child? Or will you take up the mantle of our order and enact God's justice upon your heretical brother and the heathens who support him? Lambert had found himself at a crossroads. If he continued on his current path, the likelihood was that he would not be able to achieve his goals. However, if he started to behave himself and make an actual effort into joining the order, then climbing the ranks would be an easy task for someone like himself. As such, Lambert decided to kneel before the Grand Master and pledge his servitude to the order. I apologize for my actions, Grand Master, and henceforth I will make every effort to make up for my mistakes. If God wills it, then one day I hope to be a part of the army which brings the Lord's judgment upon my wicked brother. As such, on this day, Lambert had truly begun to dedicate his heart and soul to the Teutonic Order in the hope that one day soon they could allow him to gain his vengeance. Chapter 79 Infrastructure Initiative. Currently, Berengar was within the domain of his father's study, finalizing the blueprints for the city he envisioned to be his capital, the city of Kufstein. He had been hard at work on this project for well over a month at this point, seeing as it was something he mainly worked on in his spare time. He had yet to finish it, until now, that is. As the town of Kufstein became increasingly more urbanized due to Berengar's agricultural reforms, Berengar found his people suffering from a serious concern. Despite the fact that they were being paid exceptionally well and were no longer bound by the land owned by the feudal lords, the common people of Kufstein were forced to endure terrible conditions of slums and squalor. Considering Berniger was the kind of man who despised forcing people into such destitution, he had to come up with a new plan to resolve these issues. Luckily for him, he held almost absolute power in the region and had a substantial treasury built up from the lucrative steel and textile trade. Considering he had just finished making plans for the city of Kufstein, Berengar decided to put them into action and break ground on the construction of a grand city deserving the title of capital of Kufstein. As he labeled it, this grand infrastructure initiative was designed to reconstruct the region into a thriving metropolis. The first critical component of this initiative was sanitation, where he planned to have city-wide sewers and plumbing where the waste would go through a sewage treatment facility and eventually flow into the local river. There would also be cisterns that could provide fresh and clean water into the homes of every citizen. The second critical component of this initiative was to build affordable housing in large apartment complexes. These apartment complexes would be built in the traditional half-timber style. If he was going to build a city, it was going to be an aesthetically pleasing city. Of course, Each apartment would be outfitted with its own ceramic tub and toilet connected to the city's plumbing system. The third component of this infrastructure initiative was focused on defense. With civil war looming on the horizon, Berengar needed a way to defend his population properly. He was more than happy to introduce a complex set of city walls based on the star fortress platform of the Renaissance and early modern period from his previous life. However, unlike the walls made throughout the history of Berengar's past life, his would be made out of steel-reinforced concrete, which was a much more resilient construction method than the traditional stone walls that would normally come to be. A star fortress was essentially what it sounded like. It was a fortress designed in the days of the Renaissance to combat cannons' effectiveness and commonality, which would prove to be the death blow to the old medieval castle designs. Essentially, the city would be built out of a polygon split down the middle by the Inn River. At the edges of the wall would be a series of pointed fortifications called bastions that eliminated blind spots and allowed defenders to fire upon besiegers from all angles. Above these bastions would be cavaliers, a raised structure built entirely inside the bastion that acted as a secondary line of defense, allowing more cannons and musketeers to defend the same section of the wall. Below the bastions would be a series of ditches filled with water, which was similar to a moat in design, which would make the city virtually impossible to lay siege to fully. The design was based upon many years of fortification knowledge that Berengar had gained from his time studying at Westpoint to be an army engineering officer. In this era, no army could successfully lay siege to such a well-fortified city. Fourth and finally, he needed to construct a comprehensive set of roads between all the major inhabited regions of his territory and elected for the Roman method of road construction. This would certainly be an expensive endeavor. However, he could afford such luxuries, and as such, Berengar had immediately begun the process of constructing his grand city. At the moment, Berengar was walking through the town in which he currently presided over on his path to Ludwig's workshop, which was now his office space within the industrial district. He noticed the filth and squalor his people lived in and could not help but wish to speed up time, so they no longer had to endure these conditions. Luckily for him, his plans were complete, and he would soon break ground on the project. The people only had to endure these conditions for a little while longer. Berengar boldly walked through the doors to Ludwig's office and began speaking with the old man in the steel factory about the production of galvanized steel piping to construct his plumbing system. If the steel was properly submerged in molten zinc, it could create a relatively rust-proof layer which would be essential for the construction of his plumbing system. What do you think, Ludwig? Is it possible? Ludwig stared at the details of Berengar's plans and felt a headache growing in the back of his skull. The old man sighed heavily as he looked at Berengar like he was a madman. Is it possible? Absolutely. However, it is going to be incredibly expensive to do this. Berengar clasped Ludwig on the shoulder and smiled before reassuring his old pal. Don't worry, I can cover the costs. This is not some venture that will be completed in a matter of months but will be an ongoing effort over the coming years. As long as it is possible, then I don't care about the cost. Ludwig could not help but admire the effort and expense Berengar was willing to go to ensure better housing and sanitary conditions for his people. Truly, there has never been a more benevolent lord, or so the old man thought. Ludwig could only imagine how hard Berniger had worked on the budget to ensure his vision of a grand city would become a reality. Ludwig sighed and accepted Berengar's enthusiasm for the project. All right, I'll get it done. After all, we currently have a surplus of steel that is sitting in a bunch of warehouses waiting for such a grand project. It would be a shame to let it all go to waste. Berengar smiled as he thanked Ludwig for his assistance. Good, if you will excuse me, I have many different people to contact to begin the construction of this project of mine. With that, Berengar left Ludwig behind and contacted the remaining subordinates on his list to begin constructing the Grand Infrastructure Initiative, which would later become the basis for how all German cities would be designed. Chapter 80 Revelation of Corruption. Weeks passed and Berengar was, of course, busy overseeing the construction of his grand city and also managing the affairs of the realm at large. Lind continued to manage her spy network, and Eckhard continued to train the troops. Everything was running smoothly as far as Berengar was concerned. In this time nothing major happened, though there were some minor improvements to Berengar's overall plans. For example, today was the day Ludolf finally became an ordained priest. As such, he was kneeling in the church at Innsbruck where the local bishop conducted his ordination. The ceremony was nothing extravagant, and it was soon over. When the Bishop of Innsbruck finished the ceremony, he began to speak to Ludolf, having no way of knowing that he was already in Berengar's camp. "Ludolf, I must say you have your work cut out for your working in that godless territory." This struck a nerve with Ludolf, as the land he was currently residing in was referred to as godless by the bishop simply because he disagreed with Berengar's policies. As such, he immediately defended it. "Godless? What makes you refer to Kufstein as godless?" The bishop smiled in with a condescending look as he chastised Ludolf for his naivety. "Good Ludolf, I know you have sympathies towards the people of the region, but the regent who currently commands them is a heretic, excommunicated and damned as such by the Pope himself. Clearly, the people's souls are suffering under such a wicked tyrant. It is up to you to lead the people of Kufstein to the light of God. Thank goodness we will not have to put up with that heretic for much longer." The last portion of the bishop's lecture caught Ludolf by surprise. This meant there was clearly a plot underway against Berengar, and as such he decided to dig deeper into the bishop's meaning. "I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean by that. Why will we not have to put up with Berengar much longer?" The bishop thought he was talking to someone on his and the Vatican's side, and as such had no qualms about discussing their conspiracy behind closed doors. "Why, because of the Teutonic Order, of course." Ludolf was visibly confused as he heard the bishop's orders. As such he explained the entirety of the situation to Ludolf, who listened intently. "As you may be aware, the Teutonic Order is currently at war with the Grand Duchy of Moscow. However, they have a plan to wipe the floor with those damned Russ and install the power of the Holy See over their patriarch. As such, within 6 months to a year, they will be free to bring their wrath down upon the heretics in Kufstein and annex the territory as an area of the Teutonic state. Surely the control of the territory will return to God's favored son of the von Kufstein family at that time." Ludolf was shocked, but he clearly understood what the bishop meant by that. As such he had to ask the question on his mind. "Does the Pope know about this?" The bishop merely broke out into laughter, thinking that Ludolf was joking before noticing the serious expression on his face. "Who do you think requested the aid of the Teutonic Order in this endeavor?" If previously Ludolf had any doubts about the extent in which the Catholic Church was rotten, they no longer existed. Truly, the entire Catholic Church was filled to the brim with corruption, and he could no longer stand by it. Now that he was a properly ordained priest, he would take action. He had thought about everything Berengar had told him about the Church and was certain now that everything he said was the truth. When he returned home to Kufstein, he would quickly get to an academic disputation of the Church and its corruption. He would be sure to post it on the door to the Church of Kufstein and have Berengar printed with his printing press so that it could be distributed to all learned readers across the German-speaking regions. However, at the moment he was surrounded by enemies and had to play the part of a loyal subject. As such he quickly smiled and nodded to the bishop's response. "Of course, I was merely curious. I hope Berengar gets what he deserves." As such the two communicated for a long while over a few glasses of communion wine. The revelations he heard from the bishop now that he had become an ordained priest only increased his resolve to publicly condemn the Church. Embezzlement was the least of the Church's crimes. They had done truly unspeakable things in the past, and the bishop let loose all of the details in which he was privy to after having more than his fair share of wine. Loose lips sink ships, and after a few drinks, the bishop was more than willing to share anything in which Ludolf asked. Ludolf quickly came to the realization that the institution he had once looked up to as the beacon of hope in a terrible world was utterly corrupted to the core, and it would take a miracle to save it. Berengar was right all along. Though the two had debated over the extent to which the corruption of the Church reached, he had always seen Berengar as a benevolent ruler, and kind man to those who deserved it. Ludolf had always justified Berengar's more ruthless actions as bringing the judgment of heaven onto the wicked. Even when the inquisitors were executed he did not bat an eye. Yet now he was fully convinced that Berengar's ideals were 100% correct and needed to be preached by a proper priest. Little did he know that he was playing exactly into Berengar's hands. Berengar had long since desired to use Ludolf to be the Martin Luther of this world and to usher in the Protestant movement. Something which would give Berengar a valid casus belli to seize the territories of the German world for himself after he came to power in Austria. After all, the Catholics would never let an openly Protestant state exist, and through the might of science and engineering, Berengar would bring down the influence of the Church over the German people and instate his own, one which would serve his interests. Chapter 81 Gaining the Count's Support. Adela was currently in her room playing with a letter in her hands, debating whether or not she should read its contents. On this letter was the seal of House von Habsburg-Innsbruck, and she knew of only one member of that family who would ever write to her. Obviously, this letter contained the words of Lind, though what it contained the young girl did not have the heart to find out. She was fearful it would contain the truth about the parentage of Linda's child as a way to mock her now that she was away from Berengar's company. After some time, Adela decided to open the letter and, after doing so, read through its contents with an anxious outlook. It was only after she had reread the letter 3 times did she fully relax. She realized that she had been completely overthinking things and that she should have opened it sooner. The letter contained Linda's plea to unite their families against the church's ploys to interfere with Berengar's trade. It did not contain a single spiteful comment by Lind and actually encouraged them to get along. However, there was a certain sentence that made Adela mildly upset. Her sight caught onto it and reread it constantly for nearly 10 minutes, and the passage was as follows. "For the man we both love, I see no reason that we cannot unite and do our best to aid him in his hour of need." Though Lind had always hinted about her feelings towards Berengar, and Adela indeed suspected there was a relationship between the two, at this point, Lind was outright admitting it in this letter. Adela could not help but sigh and pout as she rested her cheek in the palm of her hand while expressing her thoughts aloud. "Why did I have to fall in love with a womanizer like you?" There was nobody in the room to hear her, and as such, she merely sat in silence thinking about all the great memories she had made with Berengar over the past few months. She greatly desired to see him again, but unfortunately, her birthday was not for another month. However, despite knowing about Berengar's actions, she was not angry and instead decided to aid Lind in helping Berengar. As such, she quickly rushed to her father, who was in the middle of his study. Count Otto was going over the ledger containing the steel reserves he had amassed from trade with Berengar. At this rate, he would soon be able to supply his armies with the best equipment. Like Sigurd had envisioned, his armies would be equipped mostly with a Brigandine and steel plate mixture. As such, he was currently signing orders to produce such equipment when he heard a knock on his door. He quickly announced that the door was unlocked. "It is open." After hearing such words, Adela opened the door and approached her father with a serious expression. Adela was the youngest of Otto's daughters and the one he doted on the most. If not for the dire need of iron, he never would have engaged his favorite daughter to her once sickly cousin. Instead, he would find her a prince. However, the engagement turned out for the best as Berengar proved to be quite the capable young man and had turned a massive amount of iron into steel, which was practically a miracle in this medieval world. The couple also seemed to be greatly fond of one another, so it worked out for the best. After Adela arrived in the room, she quickly spouted out her thoughts to her father. Berengar is in trouble. This struck a nerve with Otto as he was unaware of such things. In fact, now that Berengar ruled over both Kufstein and Kitzbühel in his father's stead, the young man should be doing better than ever. As such, he questioned what exactly his precious daughter meant when she said that. "What do you mean?" Adela was unhesitant as she quickly explained the situation to her father. "The Pope has issued a decree openly endorsing the theft of his trade. Berengar does not have a reputation fearsome enough to dissuade his neighbors from engaging in such acts, let alone the territories between our land and his. If we do not issue a public statement backing him, then I'm afraid we will no longer be able to get the steel we require for the army." Count Otto was outraged when he heard this news. He immediately questioned in his own mind as to why he was not informed earlier. After thinking things through, he let loose his inner thoughts about the papacy and their constant interference into the secular realm's affairs. Why is it that the Pope always has to stick his nose into the business of the nobility? This is outrageous. I will immediately publicly denounce such a statement and stand by Berengar's side. I will also encourage my allies to do the same and make it clear what will happen if anyone dares to steal my shipments. Adela was elated by the news and ran up to her father and hugged him with joy. "Thanks, Daddy." After saying that, she left the man behind in his study alone with his own thoughts. After Adela had disappeared beyond his door, the Count pulled out a chalice and a flagon of wine and began to drink from it before sighing out loud. "Damn it, Berengar, I know the church is full of shit, but you just had to execute 2 of their fucking inquisitors. I won't be able to protect you from everything, but this is the least I can do to honor our alliance." As such, he quickly pulled out a piece of parchment and his quill. where he began to draft a public decree of condemnation against the Church and their public endorsement of theft, labeling it a violation of the Ten Commandments and unbecoming of the Vatican and the Pope, who was God's representative on earth. After doing so, he had it spread far and wide so that anyone with half a brain could realize that provoking Berengar and his alliances with two counts was a terrible idea. Ultimately, this decision would help lead to the German schism with the Catholic Church, which was on the horizon. Chapter 82 Recruitment Drive. Word eventually reached Berengar of the papacy's ploy to have him removed from power by the Teutonic Order and to place his brother Lambert in control after the region had been annexed. After all, Ludolf had immediately contacted Berengar's burgeoning spy network in Innsbruck and had them send word to Kufstein about such a conspiracy. Berengar knew that sparing his brother would come back to bite him in the ass, but for the sake of his mother, he had done so. A decision which he deeply regretted at this point. The Teutonic Order was no small force, and with his current armies, he had little chance of defeating them, as such had no choice but to boost his recruitment efforts for his militia. Ultimately, he had decided to incorporate the militia and the professional army directly under his father's command into a united unit, and train them appropriately. As far as his father's forces when he was called off to war were concerned, Berengar would hire a group of mercenaries to fight alongside the Viscount. Aside from completing his artillery battalion and raising a larger group of cuirassiers, Berengar had done little in recruitment. However, with access to double the population he once had, he now knew that he had to begin using the Barony of Kufstein and its large population to fill his ranks. But first, he had to make one innovation which he had revised after the successful campaign against Kitzbühel. As such, Berengar once more visited Ludwig's office with a new set of blueprints in hand. When he arrived, the old man was quick to greet his lord. "My lord, I was not expecting your visit. Is there anything I can help you with?" Berengar did not say a word and merely laid the designs he had drafted on the table for Ludwig to see. It was a new sword design, based entirely on the 1788 British heavy cavalry sword from his past life. If there was one thing that the conflict with Kitzbühel taught him, it is that the single-edged design of the Dusak was less effective against the heavily armored forces of the late medieval period. As such, he had to rethink the swords used by his cuirassiers, and searching through his memory, he found this gem. The blade of the sword was 38 inches in length and had a full edge on one side, with a half edge on the upper half of the other side. It was a weird mixture of a backsword and a broadsword, allowing for efficient cuts and thrusts and some more obscure attacks like the reverse slash. The hilt was almost like a basket hilt, but not quite. With a completely symmetrical guard that covered the entire hand, there was just enough space to allow for the full rotation of the wrist, making it both incredibly versatile and ambidextrous. The blade was more than tapered enough to get through the gaps in medieval plate armor, and as such, was the superior weapon for his cavalry forces. Luckily, his cuirassiers were little in number, and as such, he had not heavily invested into their Dusacs. Even Ludwig was impressed by the design and asked about Berengar's intentions. "This is?" Berengar grinned with pride as he clasped Ludwig's shoulder. "The new sword for my cuirassiers." Ludwig could not help but sigh. Every time Berengar visited him, it was either for drinks or to produce new designs. Though he had more than enough manpower to do such a thing, especially with the mass implementation of water-powered technology like the trip hammer, it just meant more work on his platter. He was already swamped with all of the production lines he was currently overseeing. After realizing he was merely switching the production of the Dusacs to these cavalry swords, he felt as if it really was not as big as a deal as he was making it and thus could not help but accept it. "All right, I'll see it done. It is a mighty fine blade after all." Berengar slapped Ludwig on the back before complimenting him. "You always know how to make me happy, Ludwig. How about we go out for drinks tonight at the tavern?" Ludwig could not help but smile. "Sure, I'll be there." Afterward, Berengar left him behind and went to his paper factory, where he encountered the men hard at work. The head of the factory quickly greeted him. "My lord, it is an honor to have you here." Berengar was used to the man's over-enthusiastic attitude at this point and quickly cut to the chase. "I need some recruitment flyers for the militia made. Here is the basic design." As such, Berengar handed the man a recruitment flyer that he had personally designed and left the rest up his factory and the many printing presses they had within it. The foreman quickly responded to Berengar's request. "I will have it done, my lord." With that, His spy network would spread his recruitment flyers across Kufstein and Kitzbühel to act as a means to recruit many volunteers. He would not come to realize how effective his propaganda would be until later than the month when the number of recruits willing to join the militia raised significantly. After all, the people of Kitzbühel were well aware of how effective his forces were, and now that Berengar ruled over them in his father's name, much more disillusioned youth were more than happy to join such an elite force. Soon enough, his armies would be substantially larger, a force that a mere viscount would not normally have under his command. Thus Berengar's militia would soon drastically increase in size. By the time the Teutonic Order invaded his domain, they would be met with a rude awakening, as such Berengar spent the rest of his day continuing on his daily tasks of overseeing the many aspects in which he was entrusted as Regent of Kufstein. He seriously began to wonder if his father was still alive. It had been quite some time since the old man went into seclusion, and though Berengar was happy that he was finally able to accomplish so much, he was apprehensive about his father's health. As such, he vowed that he would take some time in the following day to check up on the old man and try to cheer him up. After all, he had been far too busy to maintain his familial affairs as of late. Chapter 83: A Father's Grief. Berengar awoke bright and early once more. With his lover by his side, he could not help but smile at the shining of the dawn upon their gentle embrace. However, now was not the time to entertain his little pet. Instead, he quickly got out of bed and began to begin his daily exercise. Today consisted of mainly cardio. As such, he went for his daily run before engaging in swordplay with Eckhard. By now, he was at least competent enough with the sword to survive in a fight on the battlefield. Today was not a sparring day. Instead, he drilled intensely, getting the proper movement of attacks and defensive positions ingrained into his muscle memory. After nearly 2 hours of learning swordsmanship, Berengar retired to the bath where he cleaned himself before visiting his parents' chambers. Berengar arrived at the door of his family's chambers, where he knocked upon it several times before his mother opened the door. She had a look of worry on her face as she glanced upon Berengar before dragging him into the room and shutting the door behind. Shocked by his mother's actions, Berengar could not help but question her motives. "Mother, what is going on?" Gisela did not say much and merely led Berengar to the bedside where his father was resting. It had been over a month since he last saw the man, and his condition had changed for the worse during this time. The old man truly looked as if he had aged 10 years, his hair, which was starting to gray in the past, had greatly progressed in that matter, and his face was gaunt with malnutrition adding to his age. Evidently, the man had been fasting heavily and repeatedly praying to the Lord for guidance. Yet, all such actions managed to achieve was deal a significant blow to his health. He now looked worse than Berengar did when he first arrived in this world. Berengar looked at his father with a great sense of guilt. If the old man was this bad after having exiled his son, then Berengar did not want to imagine his condition if Lambert had been executed for his crimes. As a dutiful son, Berengar took responsibility for this and approached Sigurd, lying in a state of depression on his bed. After grabbing hold of his hand, Berengar spoke to his father, informing him of some of the good news that had happened over the last month or so. "Father, I want to inform you that you are now a viscount. Due to a border conflict with Kitzbühel, I have successfully conquered them, forced Baron Guntram into your vassalage. As far as Lambert is concerned, I have received news that he fits nicely in the Teutonic Order and will soon take his vows. There is no reason to be suffering so much. The boy will surely redeem himself in the eyes of the Lord soon enough." Berengar did not have the heart to tell his father that he was engaged in a serious conflict with the church and that he had been excommunicated and condemned as a heretic. Nor did he have the desire to inform the old man that the Teutonic Order planned to march on their lands within 6 months to a year in an attempt to depose himself as regent and annex the territory, allowing Lambert to rule over it under the banner of the Teutonic state. If the man heard such terrible news, he might literally die of a broken heart, and Berengar could not bear to witness such a thing. Sigurd smiled for the first time in a long time as he heard the news. It brought a brief sense of respite from the crippling guilt he felt for failing his sons as a father. He spoke weakly to Berengar with an affectionate smile. "A viscount, huh? I suppose that is good news for you, my son. Soon enough, you will inherit my lands, and you deserve far more than ruling over a lowly barony like I was able to provide for you. I regret that I will not live to see your wedding." Berengar could not help but tear up as he heard these words. His father had truly given up on life. At the rate he was going, he would not even make it to the war to which he had been so desperately looking forward to. Nor did Berengar believe that Sigurd even cared for such a thing at this point. He tried to give meaning to the old man's life in any way he could. As such, he thought about Linda's pregnancy and tried to urge his father to care about that. "Father, do not speak in such a manner, you will soon be a grandfather. Do you not wish to gaze upon the sight of your first grandchild after it has been born?" With this, Sigurd merely scoffed and returned to his depressed state as he stopped looking at Berengar and returned his gaze to the ceiling of the cold stone room. He voiced his concerns aloud, not caring how Berengar would feel about hearing them. "Peeved, a bastard child, the result of which will forever be a reminder of my failure as a parent. One of my sons conspired to murder his elder brother, and the other impregnated his younger brother's fiancée. What a masterful job I have done raising you boys." Berengar's plan to cheer up his father had completely backfired so spectacularly that he had sent his father into a further state of depression. Berengar could understand his father's grievances with his relationship with Lind. At this point he was just happy that Sigurd was unaware of how his relationship with Lind came to be. If the old man was aware that it was the result of yet another plot against his life by Lambert, he might actually die on the spot. As such, the young regent could not help but sigh in response to his father's state. There was truly nothing he could do. He was not socially adept enough to properly comfort his father through his sense of overwhelming guilt and grief. His one attempt to do so had just managed to make his father feel worse about the whole situation. He may have just caused several weeks to be taken off his father's life. Berengar needed to find something that could give the old man some hope, and quickly. If not, he feared the Reaper would take his father from him far earlier than he should. Before leaving the room, Berengar expressed his empathy for his father while choking back the anger he felt at himself for being so socially inept when comforting others about serious issues. "Get well soon, father." With that said, Berengar departed from his father's room with a sense of defeat. He did not know how to fix this situation, and all that he could manage was to throw himself into his work to avoid the sense of despair that had begun to take hold of his heart as he thought about the hopelessness of his father's current state. Chapter 84, Discussing Defense. After leaving his father's quarters, Berengar returned to the dining room where he ate breakfast. Once more, Lind and Henrietta were at the table. However, this time, the two girls were far more cordial with one another. Berengar did not know what Lind had said to Henrietta, but they appeared to be on better terms than before. At the very least, the little girl no longer seemed to pin the blame of Lambert's exile on Lind. While snacking on some wurst, Lind could not help but ask about Berengar's visit to his father, which put him in a difficult spot. If Henrietta were still secluded, he might be able to tell the truth of the matter, but with the little lowly innocently snacking on breakfast sausage he could not very well inform both of them to the severity of his father's condition. As such, he merely shrugged his shoulders and said the least dishonest thing he could think of. "I have done all that I am able." Though Henrietta was too engrossed in enjoying her breakfast to notice Berengar's solemn expression, Lind immediately picked up on it and could tell that things were not going well for the von Kufstein family, especially for the head of the household. She felt bitter after seeing that helpless expression on Berengar's face, knowing full well that if there were nothing he could do, then anything she might attempt would only worsen things. After all, Berengar's parents did not exactly accept their relationship, even if they tolerated it. As such, she snacked on her breakfast in awkward silence. Berengar, on the other hand, gazed deeply into his flagon of milk, which he desperately wished to be wine. However, he had more than enough self-restraint and forcefully deterred himself from resorting to morning drinking as a way to quench his sorrows. He preferred the slightly more healthy alternative of throwing himself into his work. As such, he quickly steered the conversation into a path more favorable for him. "The construction of the city walls is underway. Soon enough, Kufstein will be a city like no other. It might take a couple of years to achieve fully, but ultimately the designs I have planned will usher in a new age of security and prosperity for the German people." Lind had witnessed his grand plans and was excited about such a proposition. It was truly an extraordinary design, and she had no idea how Berengar kept coming up with such revolutionary ideas. She greatly admired his intellect and his approach to problems, though she felt he was spending too much money to make the common people's lives better. The defenses she could understand, but the advanced plumbing system and the complex apartments would come at great cost, and even if he rented the apartments out at a fair price as he planned, it would take quite some time to recoup his losses. As a woman who grew up in the privileged family of the higher nobility and was greatly spoiled in her formative years, some things like snobbery were hardwired into her DNA. As such, Lind could not understand Berengar's benevolent attitude towards the commoners. Though she did not understand it, she did not look down upon it. She figured Berengar's benevolence to his people was one of his better qualities. If he was a completely ruthless sociopath who only cared for himself, she figured she would never have fallen for him to the depths in which she had. Knowing that her lover's plans were progressing well made Lind feel happy, even if she felt he was spending too much money on the happiness of the commoners, as she smiled and congratulated Berengar on the current success of his grand infrastructure initiative. "That is excellent news. I can't wait to witness the city's defenses once they are completed. Your designs are impressive, to say the least." Henrietta looked up from her plate at the couple with a gaze of confusion. She had no idea what Berniger was planning, nor the ludicrous amount he was spending daily on such plans. She lived a carefree life completely devoid of any thoughts regarding the realm's future and its prosperity. However, the terms city and walls brought a minor degree of interest to her. As such, she could not help but question what Berengar was planning. Her azure eyes twinkled with excitement as she questioned her big brother about his supposed plans. "What city? Walls? What are you talking about?" Berengar could not help but smile at the innocent look on his little sister's face. It greatly calmed his nerves about the issues with his father's rapidly deteriorating health. As such, he decided to spoil the girl with information about his extravagant project. "I'm currently transforming the town into a full-fledged city. With the increase in urbanization, a lot of the locals live in horrible conditions. As such, I have plans to alleviate those concerns and build a strong defensive barrier around the city." Though Henrietta did not understand half of the words Berengar had used, she felt as if it was something extraordinary. As such, she smiled and congratulated Berengar on his progress. "Good job," she said while raising her thumb in approval. Though she would later come to realize just how effective Berengar's plans were, it would not be for some time before she came to such a conclusion. For now, the little girl merely enjoyed her food as Berengar and Lind continued their discussion about topics that bored her. After finishing her meal, Henrietta looked up at Berengar with a cute expression. Considering he was now sitting at the head of the table, it would be considered rude to run off without his permission. "Big brother, may I please be excused?" Berengar smiled and nodded, allowing the little loli to flee off to her room to play with her toys. Completely unaware that she was missing a discussion about the construction of monumental advancements in defensive technology that would one day come to dominate the cities of the future German Empire. Chapter 85. Have you no shame? A few days had passed since Berengar visited his father, and he was currently sitting on the seat of power in Kufstein, where a messenger rushed in and handed him an intelligence report. The report contained the joint public denunciation of the Church's endorsement of theft against Berengar's trade by Count Lothar of Tyrol and Count Otto of Steiermark. The counts were quite gutsy in their rebuking of the Church. They even went so far as to declare that the Pope was advocating for the people of Austria to break the seventh commandment. As such, this event caused quite a stir in the Christian world, as a proclamation by the Holy See condemning a heretic turned into quite the scandal, as there were plenty of lords, priests, and bishops who agreed with the two counts and their joint declaration. Surprisingly, several Orthodox patriarchs came out and condemned the Pope, especially the Patriarch of Moscow, whose territory was currently at war with the Teutonic Order, a Catholic military order which had invaded their lands to convert the Christians within them to the Catholic variety, which was a great point of contention between the Catholic and Orthodox churches at the moment. Berengar read the report with a wide grin. He did not know how Adela had heard about this relatively mundane matter, but he was thankful for her support. He was completely oblivious to the fact that Lind had set this up behind his back, but even if he did know, he would not be angry, as this only caused a further rift in the Christian world, in which Ludolf would be able to exploit soon enough. Speaking of Ludolf, the man was currently working on a scholarly paper written about the corruption of the Church and thought it would take some time to compile the evidence into a collection of cohesive theses. He had little doubt that soon enough, the Christian world would turn on itself. He began to wonder how his actions would affect the Council of Constance in this timeline. As he was going over these details, Lind walked in, saw the large smile on his face, and inquired about the reason for his pleasant mood. "What has made you so happy?" Berengar chuckled lightly as he placed his paper to the side and turned his attention to his beautiful lover, who by now was starting to show physical signs of pregnancy. Nothing much. I just love seeing my enemies at each other's throats. As his spymaster, he had given her maternity leave as her pregnancy had progressed, and she was mostly resting about enjoying a slothful life. As such, she was unaware of the ongoing schemes in the background. However, when he said such things, she could estimate what had happened, and thus she smiled in return. That is good to hear. Instantly a devilish idea began to form in Berengar's mind. Considering that nobody was around, he motioned for his lover to come over and sit upon his lap. He took pleasure in teasing the girl who was carrying his child. Though her cheeks began to flush in embarrassment, she could not disobey her master's orders. As such, she sat upon his lap in an awkward display in the middle of the great hall. However, as he was blowing on Linda's ears, his mother just so happened to be walking by and witnessed the affectionate display, where she quickly began to scold Berengar as she marched in his direction. Berengar, just what is it that you think you are doing on your father's seat of power? Gisella's shrill voice immediately caused Lind to attempt to hop away from Berengar's grasp in embarrassment, but the young regent managed to capture his lover in his arms and keep her in place, which caused her to look down at the ground and cover her face. This was truly a mortifying position to be in. Berengar, on the other hand, had a smug expression on his face as he responded to his mother's chastisement. Father has placed me in charge of the realm during his absence. As such, I see no reason why I cannot relax on this chair while playing around with my lover. Even a viscount needs a moment of rest now and then. Gisella's gaze immediately narrowed in response to Berengar's claims. Though it was true Berengar was viscount in everything but name, that did not mean they should behave in this manner. Especially so boldly declaring in the open that he and Lind were lovers. Did he not care about his reputation? Seeing his mother's piercing gaze, Berengar could not help but scoff internally as he held his arms tightly around Lind, preventing her from escaping from his clutches. This public display of affection had really gotten him excited. Nevertheless, he could not do anything at the moment, so he listened to his mother's lecture with a smug expression on his face. Regardless as to whether or not you can behave in this way, it is simply unacceptable. Have you no shame? Berengar laughed lightly at his mother's words, which infuriated the woman. If he acted this way as regent, she could not imagine how he would behave when he was officially viscount. However, just when she was about to chastise him further, he let out a bold answer to her question. Evidently not. Berengar truly was shameless. If he really wanted to, he would tie Lind up to a leash and have her kneel before him while he sat on his throne with her leash in hand, but he was not that wicked yet. Nevertheless, his mother would not accept his inappropriate actions any further. As such, she marched up to the seat of power with the intent to slap him. Seeing he had gone too far, he let Lind go, where she quickly scurried off while filled with an overwhelming sense of humiliation and shame. Of course, he made sure to voice his thoughts aloud as his mother stopped at the steps just below him. Damn, I love that woman. With that said, Gisela looked at him with disgust and stormed off. She could not believe her son had grown into such a womanizer. Berengar, on the other hand, began to stretch. Now that he was relaxed from the little fun he was able to achieve in this brief moment, he quickly got back to the task at hand. For a man with great ambitions like him, the work was never done. Chapter 86: Formation of a Wicked Alliance. During Linda's maternity leave, the position of spymaster was temporarily handed over to her bastard half-sister Adelheid, who operated out of Innsbruck. She was the personal maid of Lind, who had since her departure been working at the family estate and directly serving her father, Lothar. She was not exactly fond of her father due to how she had been treated throughout her youth and desperately looked up to Lind as her eldest sister and the only one who seemed to care for her. As such, she was more than eager to spy on her father's domain for her precious big sister. Of course, she was not happy with Berengar for making Lind his lover. Adelheid thought that Linda's love had blinded her to Berengar's true nature and that in truth he was an absolute scoundrel, much like her father. However, if supporting him was what Lind wanted, then she would comply. Even if she believed Lind was deserving of the position of Berengar's wife and not that little girl from Graz. Currently, Adelheid was cleaning her father's study, where she came across a variety of letters issued that exchanged the details between the Bishop of Innsbruck and her father. Now that Lambert was exiled from the House of Kufstein and sent to the Teutonic Order, Lothar's plans relied entirely on his daughter's illicit relationship with Berengar. As such, a rift had grown between him and the Bishop of Innsbruck, who kept insisting on deposing Berengar for the sake of the church. Seeing literally no benefit from this request, Count Lothar had abandoned the bishop and the church's pleas. Instead, he sided with Berengar to win his favor and potentially gain an even better deal on the steel trade. Adelheid read over all of the information she could gather from the Bishop of Innsbruck and her father's correspondence and added it to the web of knowledge she had collected. As she was looking over the information, she heard footsteps and a pair of voices approaching, one of which she recognized to be her father's. Thus she quickly put away the letters in the order she had found them and began to sweep around the office, making herself look busy. By the time her father and the unknown figure arrived in his office, they noticed Lothar's bastard daughter fulfilling her duties of cleaning the room and felt no suspicion whatsoever. After all, as his personal maid, that was something she ought to be doing. The Count did not even mind her presence as he began to speak with a man dressed in the attire of a bishop, who Adelheid recognized as Bishop Ernest of Innsbruck. The man was morbidly obese and was easily in his 60s. He had a particularly troll-like face, and was completely bald with a long mustache that looked like a set of walrus tusks which were as white as snow. This fat bastard looked lustfully at Adelheid as she cleaned the office in the background. Noticing his sinful gaze, Lothar snapped at him. "Don't even think about it." Considering the fat old man was here to negotiate with the Count of Tyrol about withdrawing his support for Berengar, the man snarled but ultimately retracted his gaze before speaking to Lothar in an obviously fake polite tone. "Count Lothar, I'm sure you are aware that by supporting a condemned heretic like Berengar, your very soul is at risk of sharing that same fate as his." Lothar pulled out a pair of chalices and then filled them with wine, handing one to the fat old bishop before discussing his terms with the man. "Cut to the chase. I do not want to hear any bullshit from you. If you do not give me something of worth, then I will not think about abandoning the boy in favor of your lot." The old bishop grimaced as he heard those words. He was well aware of Berengar's miraculous ability to turn iron into steel. He was also aware of Lothar's ambitions to be Duke of Austria, and as such, even with the overwhelming wealth of the church, he would have to pay a heavy price in order to convince the Count to join his side. Adelheid keenly listened to this conversation as she quietly cleaned in the background. Neither of the two men was concerned about whether or not she overheard their conversation and the potential conspiracy it may contain. As such, the bishop quickly spoke his terms he was willing to present to win Lothar's favor. "Very well, what the church is willing to offer you is the entire Prince Bisifric of Kur to add to your domain." Not only was Count Lothar shocked, but so was Adelheid. This was no small domain owned by the church which bordered the county of Tyrol. It contained many resources and a relatively large population. If Lothar acquired this, he would be able to increase his wealth and military power vastly. He could not believe the church was willing to go so far to put down a minor viscount. As such, he had to clarify the issue. "You will give me the entire region of Kur?" The bishop nodded his head in approval as his next words confirmed his offer. "The Holy Father has already approved it. All you have to do is side with us when the time is right and invade Kufstein alongside the Teutonic Order." Count Lothar thought about it for several moments. The minerals, wealth, and forces he would gain from Kur would be worth more in total than the trade he had with Berengar. As such, he had no reason to decline, especially when he considered the fact that he despised the boy who had knocked up his favorite daughter. As such, Lothar reached out his hand and cemented the alliance with the church. Though he would still officially remain on Berengar's side for the time being, when the time was right, he would turn on the boy regent and bring order to his territory once more. He did not care who ruled over Kufstein so long as they submitted to him. The fat old bishop laughed heartfully as he shook the count's hand and declared their alliance on the spot. "I knew you were a man of great faith. Together, we shall destroy this heretic and prevent his views from spreading across Europe. He has already caused more damage to the faithful than you may realize." The truth of the matter was, with the scandal the Vatican had found itself in over the matter of publicly endorsing the seizing of Berengar's assets and the letter of rebuttal the two counts had made against them, Berengar's popularity was rising among the German nobility, and his views were currently being spread in his propaganda. It would not be long before this heresy, in which the church had officially deemed the Berengar heresy, spread to every corner of the German world. At that time, the church would lose significant power, and as such, They were willing to give up such a huge chunk of land to get rid of Berengar as quickly as possible. After all, they did not want the Teutonic Knights to have to face Count Lothar's forces, nor did they wish to engage in an entire crusade just to put down this growing heresy. Overhearing this grave threat to Berengar, and more importantly, her dearest sister, Adelheid, was more than happy to report this news to Lind at the first opportunity available. As such, after witnessing this despicable alliance being formed, she used the first chance she got to leave the office and write a letter to Lind informing her about the threats that had begun to manifest within Innsbruck. Chapter 87 Counter-Conspiracy. Lind sat in her quarters within the castle of Kufstein. She received a letter which was written from her sister. In this letter, it described the scene in which Adelheid had witnessed and their father's treachery. The girl twirled a strand of her strawberry blonde hair in boredom as she read the words. She suspected sooner or later her father would betray her lover. It was only a matter of time before the church offered him something he could not refuse. After reading the words the letter contained, Lind burned it before leaving her room, seeking out Berengar to inform him of the crucial issue at hand. Before long, she found Berengar in his father's study reviewing the ledgers on his grand infrastructure initiative. When Lind arrived in the study with a worried expression, he could guess that her sister had reported some troublesome news, and as such, he immediately inquired about the details. "Well, don't keep me waiting." Lind immediately shut the door behind her and informed Berengar of the matters reported to her. "The Bishop of Innsbruck has promised my father the Prince Bisifric of Kur so long as he aids in the invasion of your realm when the time comes. He has accepted these terms, and thus in doing so, betrayed you." Berengar contemplated what this meant for a few moments. The Teutonic Order was sure to send a large army to enter his lands, but with the Count of Tyrol, on the other hand, would at best send a small punitive task force. He had greater ambitions than to gain the city of Kur, and by the time the Teutonic Order could muster a force to attack Kufstein, the kingdom would either be on the brink of civil war or fully engaged in it. This truly did not change Berengar's plans all that much. In fact, this could be considered a blessing in disguise. By betraying Berengar and the alliance they had formed, Count Lothar was giving him a justifiable reason to invade his territory. As such, Berengar decided at that moment on his plans to usurp the county of Tyrol from Linda's father. A wicked grin spread across his face as he thought of such things, confusing Lind as that was not the reaction she was anticipating, forcing her to ask why he was behaving so oddly. "Why the hell are you smiling? Isn't this a serious matter?" Berengar could not help but further smile at Linda's response, but ultimately he decided to inform her of the changes to his plans. "Actually quite the contrary, this is wonderful news." Lind looked at her lover and master as if he were a lunatic before expressing her doubts. How could this possibly be considered wonderful news? Berengar got up from his seat and approached Lind, where he began to rub her shoulders as he explained the depths of his plots. "Your father will at most send a few hundred men to honor the alliance with the church. The reason being is that he can't afford to lose many men here in Kufstein. He has already threatened me once, and I easily repelled the bluff by addressing this point. The safety of Kufstein will be secured either way. On the contrary, this gives me a justified reason to march on Innsbruck and usurp his title when he is off at war trying to usurp the duchy." Linda's gaze shifted from one of looking at a madman to looking at a genius. She struggled to believe Berengar came up with such a diabolical scheme directly after hearing about the news she thought was disastrous. This was why he was the man she had chosen, gentle but firm to his loved ones while being utterly ruthless to his enemies as a true man should be. At this point, Lind had no allegiance to her father, and if Count Lothar realized that his precious daughter had completely turned on him, he would do his damned to personally flay Berengar for warping her mind to such a degree. Berengar no longer questioned her loyalty. She had proven herself to be absolutely obedient to him on many occasions. As such, he merely hugged his favorite pet from behind and stroked her hair. However, it was not long before he heard a knock on the door interrupting his fun. As such, Berengar ceased his activities and answered the door, where he saw the figure of Eckhard. The man immediately realized he was interrupted something by the cold gaze of Berengar, and the flushed expression on Linda's cheeks. However, since he was already here, he decided to attempt to give his report. "My lord, may I have a minute?" Berengar nodded and allowed Eckhard into the room, where he proceeded to sit down before the desk and pour a couple of glasses of wine. After taking a sip from the chalice, Berengar motioned for Eckhard to continue. "Go on." As such, Eckhard stood at attention with a look of pride on his face. My liege, we have so many recruits joining our forces from the region of Kitzbühel that we have filled the artillery battalion. As such, I require a directive on where I should focus on the training of the troops next. Berengar thought about it for a moment before he issued his decree. We should focus on establishing a full battalion of cuirassiers, a minimum of 800 men. Any additional men should begin forming the 2nd Infantry Battalion. Send the expense report to me when it is drafted, and I will approve of it. After hearing his lord and commander's orders, Eckhard pounded his chest in a salute and marched off after accepting the terms. Yes, my lord. Lind looked in shock as she realized that Berengar's military might would be greatly expanding soon. 800 cavalrymen was no small amount, even by the standards of a viscount. Luckily his population had doubled recently, and he could afford to draft so many men into his army. Knowing the technological edge in which his forces had, Lind could not help but think that Berengar's army would soon be the most capable in the world. Berengar, on the other hand, was satisfied with the results of his recruitment drive. He was certain that before the Teutonic Knights arrived, he would have 2 full battalions of infantry, roughly 2,400 men in total, a full battalion of cavalry numbering anywhere between 800 and 200 men, and a full artillery battalion numbering a total of 450 men, and 18 field guns. All in all, his army would be capable of defeating whatever force the Teutonic Order brought down upon him, so long as it was not the full army, which he highly doubted they would do considering their position with their neighbors. Just like this, a counter-conspiracy to the Church's plots was put in place to destroy the enemies of Kufstein utterly, and by extension, its regent.